Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the zodiac sign Capricorn and talking about its characteristics and traits and meaning, and basically doing a whole 2-hour deep dive into the meaning of this sign. So joining me today are astrologers Diana Rose Harper and Madeline DeCotes. Welcome, both of you.
Hi.
Hi, it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today. Diana, this is your 10th appearance on the podcast. You actually also have the distinction of being one of the few people that's joined me in both the planetary series and now the zodiac series, having done this Saturn episode together last year. And Madeline, this is your first time on the show.
Correct.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit first. I like to open these episodes talking about what your credentials are and getting a little bit of a resume in terms of your Capricorn placements. Diana, let's start with you. What are your placements?
So I have a Capricorn rising, Saturn, and Venus. I also have the lot of Eros and the lot of Fortune in Capricorn, and Neptune and Uranus, and the asteroids Eros and Hygieia. So a lot of Capricorn happening.
All right. Well, that's a little bit of stellium there, a little stellium action going on. I think that's pretty good. But then you've also got that balancing Sagittarius stellium of Sun, Moon, and Mercury in Sagittarius as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Good times. That's pretty good credentials. I think the Leo people had a stellium measuring contest at one point. So I think you're up there in terms of beating them out, especially once you include some of those other points.
Mm-hmm.
Madeline, what about you? What are your credentials?
Yeah, I'm also a Capricorn rising and part of the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune in Capricorn generation. But, I might win just because I have Mars on the ascendant in Capricorn. Just going to put that out there.
And in a really beautiful trine to Venus and Taurus.
Thank you. It is a beautiful trine. Thank God. That's all I can say. Thank God.
Nice. I like that Mars placement in Capricorn. I think that is the best placement. I think everyone objectively agrees. As we'll see when we get to my chart, which also has Mars in Capricorn. So both of you are from that generation of the late 1980s when there was that pileup of stuff in Capricorn. And then you have that concentrated, both of you, in your rising sign, which is pretty notable.
Yeah, there's definitely an experience of embodying quite literally generational signatures. Also, I apologize for the loud sound. I don't know what is happening in my neighbor's house, but it just started as soon as we started recording.
That's fine. It's not too bad right now from our perspective, so we might be okay. I've got some stuff as well, so we'll see how it goes. One thing that's cool I just noticed randomly in both of your charts is you both have those generational placements in Capricorn with the outer planets, but then one of you has Venus there as well as a personal planet, and then one of you has Mars there as a personal planet, which is kind of an interesting trade-off there and sort of balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really brings it home, I think, probably Diana, you were saying, embodying that generation. I feel that pretty strongly. We're here to do the work.
Right. And you have a night chart, right, Madeline? I didn't actually see where your sun was.
Yeah, it's in the 4th.
Right. So that brings the Mars component even more strongly forward. I have diurnal triplicity with Venus in Capricorn. So we both have strengthened personal planets in the 1st in Cap.
There we go.
Yeah,
that's really cool. I like that. For myself, I did pretty much most of this zodiac series having none of the placements that we were talking about. So it's not until the very end that I get to say that I actually have some of my own credentials, which is that I have Jupiter and Mars in Capricorn in my birth chart in the 12th house. So while I can't speak to the big stellium energy that both of you have in Capricorn, I can at least talk about it a little bit from that perspective. So we'll see how it goes.
That's very interesting too, to have the planet exalted in Capricorn as well as the planet in fall. So we'll probably touch on that more when we get to that part of the episode.
That is an excellent transition because that's what we'll talk about right now with this beautiful diagram that Paula Bellomini designed for us, which shows first the symbol for those watching the video version, or the glyph for Capricorn. Capricorn is the name of the sign. So Capricorn, in terms of its basic stats or qualities, is a feminine or nocturnal sign. It's one of the three. It's the third earth sign in the series of the zodiac, using the 4 qualities of earth, air, fire, and water. In terms of modality, it's a cardinal sign in terms of the modalities of cardinal, fixed, and mutable. In terms of planetary rulerships, Capricorn is the first planet in our series that's ruled by the planet Saturn, which is the furthest and slowest visible planet. Capricorn is also said to be the sign of the exaltation of Mars, where the planet Mars is raised up. It's said to be the sign of the detriment or antithesis of the moon, since it's opposite to the moon's home sign of Cancer. And it's said to be the sign of the fall or the depression of Jupiter, since it's opposite to the sign of the exaltation of Capricorn of Jupiter, where Jupiter is raised up in Cancer. So those are the basic qualities that we're going to be talking about here. And here's a diagram which just shows the signs of the zodiac in general, where we started out many episodes ago, 10 episodes ago, back with Aries. We've now gotten up to the top of the zodiac with the sign of Capricorn. All right. So starting points, where should we start in terms of talking about this sign, or where do the two of you like to start when you think about, when you talk about and conceptualize this sign?
Can I just quickly interject for the audio listeners? There's a very cute typo on that graphic. It said domicile of the Saturn, which I thought was very appropriate.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty good. I think you should put a definitive in front of most like Capricorn and Saturn things.
That's what it feels. Yeah, domicile of the Saturn, unlike Aquarius, domicile of the fake Saturn.
Right. Yeah.
The real Saturn we find in Capricorn.
Just kidding. Aquarians are very Saturnian.
Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind whenever I talk about Capricorn, my impulse is to immediately address stereotyping when it comes to Capricorn. And a large part of that, I think, is the stereotype. It very much focuses on the cardinality as well as the earthiness in terms of building materiality, like building material resources, which, that tracks with it being cardinal. That is to say, initiating, like trying to get stuff done, and being an earth sign having to do with the tangible in some way.
Yeah.
And it's really easy. Oh, go ahead.
And that's a good starting point, just because we're definitely building this up as if the person doesn't have any preconceptions about the sign and is learning this for the first time, so that, we might want to establish some of that stuff if we're taking that for granted before knocking down some of the misconceptions, the preconceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like the things I think about with cardinal earth are things like tectonic plate action that creates mountains, right? Or, the rifts at the bottom of the ocean where like lava comes up and it literally creates the seafloor, or whenever there are underwater volcanoes that eventually create archipelagos, like islands and things like that. There's something very much, I am building something substantial that comes with the territory of Capricorn. That's
great. I love that. So the cardinal earth energy, because that's one of the issues sometimes with other cardinal signs like Aries, it can have that great initial push and that fierce initial drive to create something, but it doesn't have sometimes a lot of staying power or a lot of long lastingness. And Capricorn is the cardinal sign that the most out of the 4 cardinal signs, because it's ruled by Saturn, even though it has that quality of being a cardinal sign, still seems like it has a greater sense of permanence or lastingness or endurance to a certain extent compared to the other 4 cardinal signs.
Yeah, building durability. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I love that imagery as well with the what you're describing, Diana, with what creates mountains and what creates land masses, and sort of the inherent violence in that, which might speak to, again, the allusion to Mars having its exaltation in Capricorn, or the notion that Capricorn, there's some suffering or some pain, requisite in creating something that's long lasting. So that visualization of tectonic plates ramming together, and then the result is continents.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like the ring of fire along the Pacific Ocean, where there's so much volcanic activity. There's so much land being built, but there's also quite a lot of caution that you have to take in these areas. As somebody that's on the west coast of North America, there's quite a lot of tectonic activity, and so you have to be aware that at any moment in the process of the creation of land or the interactions of land masses, like there can be destruction too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely that looming quality to living on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
I recall I lived in Portland, Oregon for 10 years, and just the imminent threat of the big one is coming. We're due for the big earthquake anytime. Set a very, there's like a Capricornian tone there, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just be prepared. We all might die soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost wore my hoodie today that says death is certain, and it has like 2 dancing rats with flower crowns on it. It's like very, the humor, but also the reality of, all creation has alongside it destruction. There's sort of this Saturnian awareness with Capricorn of the finitude of materiality, which is part, at least in my experience, that's part of the kind of cardinal impulse to create things that endure. Like, can we push the edge of how long things can last? Because nothing actually can last forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pursuing like personal material comforts is irrelevant to Capricorn for that reason. Because in that grand scheme of things, like, et cetera, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
It seems like in that way it's contrasting sort of Cancer, which is more of a nurturing sign ruled by the moon, whereas Saturn, to the extent that it nurtures something, it does it more through testing and trial and sort of like attrition, and like that which isn't strong enough doesn't survive. So it's sort of like evolution or something like that, which is much more of a harsh way of things growing, rather than one where things are just like supported and nurtured and kind of like babied into existence.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think about, like, I know we'll talk more about the balance between Cancer and Capricorn, but one of the things I think about is Capricorn is the bucket, and then Cancer is the milk that goes in the bucket. The milk is supposed to be consumed. It's going to be used up really quickly. But if you have a really good bucket, like that bucket can be around for multiple generations. And there's lots and lots of batches of milk that gets held in the bucket. Like Capricorn is not the nourisher, but that which holds the nourishing thing. So it's like, I don't really care about the nourishing thing as long as I know I can hold it.
Yeah, that which provides form or like structure and support to that which nourishes. But because then the opposite is like, if you've got a leaky bucket or like a hole in your bucket that's like defective, then it's not going to be able to hold that nourishment and effectively do its job, essentially.
Yeah. And, it's like milk is crucial for the growing of the structures of young ones, right? So there's also this idea of you have to hold that which will contribute to structures by having a structure to hold the nourishing thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we're getting into a lot of like Saturn keywords, and I think this is really good and really important as a baseline, since that's something we focused on in every sign pretty early on, which is just what is the ruling planet. And unlike some of the other signs where we've seen almost every of the other planets at this point, this is the first time that we've encountered Saturn as a ruler of the sign of the zodiac, or within the context of the signs of the zodiac. What are some basic keywords for Saturn that are kind of relevant for Capricorn? It sounds like so far we're talking about things like structure, but also issues related to like time and impermanence and other things like that, it seems like.
I think labor is another big one, with those traditional associations of Saturn sort of representing the working class, or the people in society who have to exchange their labor for livelihood, as opposed to, say, the sun, being the ruling class. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like essential workers, have like this kind of Saturnian element in that they are foundational for the continuance of society. And so like foundation, I feel like is a Saturn word that I would associate with Capricorn, as well as like legacy, legacy as a consequence of durability or endurance of whatever the thing might be. Legacy, there's
almost all things that are old and ancient and enduring, like ancient ruins, elderly people,
rocks,
anything that's been just rocks,
like literally
anything
rocks, the bones
around and seen a lot. Fossils.
Bones, like literally bones. Oh man, I just had a word and it just left.
So Camille Michelle Gray helped do some research for this episode, and in her notes she wrote down some keywords for Capricorn, such as hard work, discipline, groundedness, responsibility, long-term planning, practicality, and that Saturn brings in archetypes of time, the elder, seriousness, self-denial, aloofness, restriction, consolidation, and structure. I thought that, go ahead.
I was just going to say limitation is also one that I think comes up quite strongly with Saturn, especially Saturn in its earthy place. What are the limitations of materiality and reality, and how does that affect your long-term planning and your ideas around what's worth investing in? I think investing is another thing I would associate with Saturn and Capricorn.
Yeah, that makes me think of time and one of those issues of like, what are some of the fundamental things that all of us have, or what are we exchanging, for example, when we do work? And sometimes it gets reduced into things like labor, which is an obvious one, or energy, like to whatever extent we have like energy and we're expending energy on something. But the other and possibly like most fundamental thing is just time, that each of us has a certain finite amount of time in our lives in which we're going to be alive. And when we work on something or direct our attention to something or do work for somebody else, part of what we're giving up is time. And there's something about that, I think, that ties in the Saturn element here to Capricorn.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. Capricorn is very aware of time, of the just as an unavoidable construct, but almost even taking pleasure in that, I would think. Like there's a bit of just anyone with strong Capricorn placements like enjoys things that are time boxed or that are constrained by time to a certain extent. We might get into this when we talk about how Capricorn differs from Sagittarius, but how Sagittarius loves, freedom and the open road and just the ability to be itself and go wherever it pleases. Capricorn, is a reaction to that, almost prefers fewer options, a clear sense of like a definitive constrained amount of time to work with. The reaction to all of that Jupiterian freedom and openness, I feel comes up with Capricorn.
That's great. I'm glad you brought that up, because I forgot that that's actually been my jumping off point in the past several episodes, which is the corrective quality that each sign of the zodiac has that follows the previous sign of the zodiac. So that actually would be a really good thing for us to focus on here. And that's a good, we're moving from a mutable Jupiter ruled sign and a fire sign with Sagittarius suddenly to a cardinal sign that's an earth sign that's ruled by Saturn. So it's almost like moving from it's almost like night and day in terms of the contrast between those two signs in some ways. And that's maybe how you start to understand Capricorn more than anything else, is in some ways as a reaction to some of the excesses of Sagittarius in some instances.
Yeah, there's very much a reality check that Capricorn brings. And I think this is even one of the ways to understand the transition of Jupiter at home in Sagittarius to being in fall in Capricorn. And one of the ways that I've thought about this and even experienced this when Jupiter moved from Sag to Cap in the past, 2019?
Oh yeah.
Am I getting that year right?
That was a rough transition.
It was
December 2019.
significant. It was very significant, right? But it's like Jupiter and Sag is just like everything is possible. Look at all these different ways we can think about things. Like, wow, the world is so cool. Like, what if we did blah 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 blah? And then it reaches Capricorn, and Saturn's like, all right, where's your blueprint? Where's your budget? Where are your materials? Are you ready to actually put in the blood, sweat, and tears to build this castle in the sky you've been imagining this whole time? Capricorn is kind of asks you to put your money where your mouth is.
And the inherent sacrifice, necessary in that. I feel like sacrifice is another good Saturn keyword. So if you've gathered so many ideas and possibilities in Sagittarius, you're excited, you're mutable fire, you're going in all these different directions and like in love with life. Capricorn, like the next step, like you're saying, is to just decide which out of all these possibilities you're actually going to focus on, because you can't, if you scatter your energy in too many directions, you're never going to accomplish anything.
Right.
So you have to give up on some of those dreams. And I feel like that's part of the Jupiter and fall aspect. It's like there aren't unlimited possibilities. If you actually want to accomplish something, you're going to have to narrow your focus.
Absolutely. There's something about the path with Capricorn. It's like, with Sagittarius, it's like Mustangs running freely across the plains. But with Capricorn, it's like the narrow path through the mountain range. And if you are going to accomplish reaching the peak, you can't just splat your energy all over the place. You have to be really focused and dedicated in order to really have that achievement as a feather in your cap.
I like that image too of the Mustangs running across the wild open plains and seeing them transition into the mountain goat. If you've seen those images of the mountain goats who just climb these sheer rock faces to get, just because they're so focused on getting that lick of salt.
Right. Or the psychoactive moss, or
to each their own Capricorn goal. Which I think is a good, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just, that little point about the psychoactive moss reminded me that once we get into the stereotypes, I guess, of Capricorn, there can be that misconception that Capricorn is always striving for something like whatever, like climbing to the top of the corporate ladder or, building an empire. Like, it's very subjective, whatever that person's chart is, whatever is important to them. It could be anything, but then Capricorn placements help focus in on getting to that anything, whether it's building a company or reaching your psychoactive moss on the mountaintop.
Right.
One of the contrasts I like that you brought up, Diana, was the because we talked about this a lot in the Sag episode, was just that Sagittarius was sometimes was fueled by optimism, and that was such a core component because sometimes it was necessary in order to drive them forward, in order to reach their goals, was this almost like unlimited capacity for optimism, but also the feeling like sometimes the opposite or pessimism could drag them down or stop them from their almost like magical ability sometimes to manifest good luck and success just through visualizing and believing that was possible in this almost like unlimited capacity to do that in some of the most extreme instances. And that actually is really important because that seems like it is a core thing that changes once you get to Capricorn, is that you get sometimes, and one of the stereotypes is a fundamental pessimism. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, but there's different ways in which sometimes that's a good thing, actually, that the pessimism is a good thing that's more grounded in reality and just the reality of what the world is like and what's going to be necessary in order to accomplish things, versus sometimes, like all signs, there can be a way that can be taken too far in a negative way, where one of the primary keywords becomes Saturn's keyword of no, or that no, something won't happen, or that the first response, as opposed to Sagittarius or even Pisces to a certain extent, where the initial desire or impulse is to say yes to everything. The initial impulse on Saturn's part or Capricorn's part is to say no to things.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just making me think about how I think both Saturn and Jupiter and their respective signs are really interested in what's possible. But from the Jupiter sign perspective, it's like, what's possible? Like sparkly eyes. And from the Saturn sign perspective, it's what's actually possible, right? There's that realism, which can feel like pessimism when it's face to face with ungrounded optimism, but is really about like actually, like, especially with Capricorn, actually making it happen requires you to be judicious around your aspirations. And it's like, it's possible that it could be better than we can even imagine. And also, it's not going to happen if we don't actually have some skin in the game. So let's go actually move things around and do stuff rather than just dreaming about it.
Yeah, like the notion that our thoughts create reality is all well and good, but our actions, that cardinality of Capricorn, I think is where that comes in, where they're like, all right, cool, Sagittarius, have fun daydreaming. I'm going to actually get to work now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes reality creates reality.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like I envision Capricorn turning to Sagittarius being like, cool story, bro.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, how's that going for you, bro?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the cardinality in the Earth. So this is the third time that we've encountered Earth. And in Taurus, we saw it. One of the analogies was like a beautiful garden with flowers and things like that, which is kind of contrasted with Libra, the other Venus ruled sign, as like an art gallery, like something artificial or man-made, and that was more, not organic in that way, but Taurus being like an organic garden. Virgo, the analogy was more like an apothecary, or like a garden that has like a bunch of herbs that are actually useful that you can put to work for something specific, especially for healing purposes. So when we get to Capricorn and the type of earth that represents, we've talked about, mountain ranges, and we've talked about like tectonic plates and things like jutting out of the ground. What are some other like earth related sort of keywords that might help us understand this as the third earth sign?
Quarries. So like place where you go to harvest actual stone. So you're not plucking flowers and you're not gathering for the apothecary. You're getting what you need to build the building.
Nice. So you're finding a place where you can literally like cut stone like out of a mountain in like chunks or in cubes, and then like haul it somewhere in order to make that like the foundation of like a building or a city.
Yeah.
Similarly, in that foundational component, I think of the flower garden and the apothecary are on the land that Capricorn like worked its butt off to purchase. Like,
that's good.
Taurus and Virgo collaborated with Capricorn. Capricorn was like, I'll get the land. You guys do your pretty stuff. We'll form the business together. It's providing that structure, that focus for, like the hobbies or the craft skills of Taurus and Virgo. Yeah.
That you saying that was just reminding me that all soil is made out of dead stuff.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And like Saturn is the reaper, Saturn is the end of life. But every time we have an end of life, unless you're, completely pickled inside of a coffin, your body returns to the earth and facilitates ongoing life. So when we're talking about Capricorn is literally the land, that's also all of the dead things that have contributed to that being soil, right? It's like the active compost is Scorpio, where it's like real smelly, but the functional dirt, that would be Capricorn.
Functional dirt, that is Capricorn.
The compost.
Another great tagline.
Yeah.
I like that. So the compost heap, or the result of the death and recycling of things that turns it back into fertile soil that can be used over in future generations.
Yeah. I mean, even just thinking about like Saturn or Kronos as historically being agricultural gods, right? And this understanding that all of the wealth comes from the land, like all genuine wealth comes from land, whether that's the wealth of abundant crops or the wealth of like I would say mines would be another kind of Capricorn place of doing effort to gather up the valuable resources that are underground, whether that's valuable because, you need metal for your swords or your plows or whatever, or valuable because it's gold. And, gold is not super functional in a lot of ways, but it's really pretty. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me again of that contrast with Sagittarius as being like being tied to nothing, having the freedom to go anywhere, versus Capricorn investing in something tangible and then maybe having the freedom within that to create whatever you want, but through that tangible, like perhaps land-based investment.
Mm-hmm.
And then land also makes me think of like generational wealth, and like the transfer of like land ownership was like historically like a way of a transfer of generational wealth and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that remains the case, at least inside of this particular economic structure. And that also makes me think about stewardship, right? Because I think Capricorn can very much be a steward and not just an owner. And so to think about the very long term, so not just the short term wealth creation of like flipping a house, or even the relatively short term of wanting to own a house so you can leave it to your kids, but the longer and larger picture of what does it mean to be in right relationship with the land in a way that facilitates multiple generations of not just human continuance, but also the endurance and durability of ecosystems. I would say that's also very Capricornian, of just like pursuing sustainability in the deepest and broadest sense. Right. And like, I know one of our examples for Capricorn is Greta Thurnberg. Like, what does it mean to be investing deeply in a future you may not be alive inside of?
That perspective of knowing that your actions and, in your lifetime do have ramifications for generations unseen.
Yeah.
Well, and also fear, because like one of the big Saturn keywords is fear, and that ties into the pessimism thing. But one of the things you switch to when you get out of Sagittarius and the optimism is Saturn and Capricorn, and the fear of things that are coming in the future, or fear of having a lack of something, or fear of something going away. Because one of the things about Capricorn, and maybe we should tie this in astronomically, is we're using the tropical zodiac, and most of this system was developed in the northern hemisphere, where once you get to Capricorn, you hit the winter solstice, where you have the longest nights and the shortest days, where the sun has sort of gone as far away as it possibly can, and you're in a much darker state where it seems like the night is seeming to dominate over things. And it's also very cold, and it's like wintry, and it's snowing. You can't grow anything, like all of the plants have died, and it's like the middle of the winter season where things are at their most either dead or hibernating, let's say, in order to get through the harsh winter. So there's this real sense of, if you don't do a good job during the summer, that you really are going to reap the rewards of or the failures of that, in terms of, if you have enough food to get through the winter, you're like doing pretty well at this point. But if you didn't plan things out well, or didn't do a good job of working hard during the winter or during the summer of harvesting things, then you're basically like starving and like shivering during this part of the year, and you're not having a very good time. And once you've had that experience, it instills like a certain amount of fear for you next time, that if you make the same mistake, that might happen again. So that becomes like fear becomes a driving factor, which sometimes can be bad, or other times can actually be good motivation.
Absolutely. There's an awareness of the perpetual potential of austerity that Capricorn holds, and sometimes that can lead to choosing austerity as much as possible. So there's a minimum amount of attachment to unnecessary things. An example just for myself, it's like I've never ever been interested or understood the appeal of cigarettes, because there's this idea of being attached in a necessary way to something that's expensive and also is going to shorten my lifespan, that just doesn't make sense to me. Even though I can also recognize that there is quite a lot of pleasure that cigarettes can facilitate, right? I'm just like, I don't want to be in a position where I have no money and I really need a cigarette, you know? And that fear can also lead to, you know, one of the Saturn words is greed or avarice, right? This sort of hoarding mentality of I need to get as much as possible for myself, not for any like higher ideal, but just because I'm never going to have enough. Like I just need more and more and more of this thing that might create eventually a sense of security. But whenever it's not addressed as, you know, whatever the underlying insecurity is, when that's not addressed, it's just like, no, more and more and more. It gets very Scroogey. I can't be generous because I don't have enough to be.
Yeah, I think that comes up with Capricorn place. I had that once with a client, actually. I was going to use as an example, but it was like a client who had Capricorn rising, and he had Saturn in Aquarius in the second whole sign house in a night chart. And I gave like a little delineation of like, this seems to show a focus on money, but that there may be fears or challenges surrounding this in your life. And he was like, no, that doesn't really track. And I was like, okay. But he was there with his wife because it was, they wanted to do a consultation together. And she was like, no, that fits you perfectly. She was like, you grew up in the Great Depression and your family was extremely, extremely poor. And a common saying around the house was, that's all we have. And that left as she continued to explain, and then eventually got him to like open up about, that left such a huge imprint on his mind that he'd always been extremely careful with money and finances, to the point of being, what is the term for that? You just used it. Like
avaricious?
Almost like, like Scrooge, or like penny pinching. Even
Stingy.
eventually stingy. That's one of the keywords that's sometimes associated with Capricorn. Even once he had become successful, and even once he didn't have financial hardships, that still stuck with him, and he was still extremely sort of like cheap to a certain extent, basically, is the way his wife described it. I actually saw a post on Reddit that made me think of that today that I wanted to share really quickly, because I thought it was like vaguely appropriate. And while I don't know anything about like any birth chart placements with these people, it sort of reminded me of that client and that story, where the title of it was, "My boyfriend is so cheap that it's literally a turn off." And she said, so everyone likes a good deal. Okay, so everyone likes a good deal around the clearance section, but this is 10 times worth. My boyfriend is the cheapest person I've ever known. But what's funny is that he's extremely wealthy. Before you all say I'm some sort of gold digger, I fell in love with him before I knew he had money. And then she goes on about, she says he always brags about how every article of clothing he has is from Goodwill and how it was only $2. You can tell because his clothes are faded and ripped in some places. And she just keeps going on about like this really interesting situation, because eventually they had Christmas and like they gave gifts, but he gave her like this stuff he found at Goodwill, and they got in a fight about it. And I'm sure there's like different perspectives and ways that you could kind of interpret this situation more positively or more negatively, but it was interesting, and I wanted to explore that a little bit, where that comes from, because I know that's one of the keywords that sometimes gets associated with Capricorn, is a sort of stinginess, maybe partially due to fear of a lack of something. I know that that's one place it can come from, but perhaps there's like other places it can come from at the same time.
There's also like a self-negation quality, like almost like a pride in suffering, like a pride in doing with as little as possible, that I think is really interesting.
Austerity.
Yeah, like the pride and austerity, even just this idea that, austerity or asceticism is somehow purifying in some way, which, it can be, but if you fast forever, you will speed up your death, right? And this is making me think about the quality of Capricorn as dry, right? Like this stinginess, this dryness. And it's like whenever things desiccate, the life goes out of them, right? Like, for some reason, I'm being reminded of, you know, how in the Dune world, you know, they have the still suits, which are these outfits that collect all of your sweat and other forms of liquid and then purifies it so that you can recycle it. And there's even this,
yes.
yeah, everyone, like, just what you do it. You're just like constantly recycling your water. And like water is this like super, super, super precious resource. And people who like have access to more water, they're called water fat, right? They might not be like plump in like extra flesh way, but because they are properly hydrated, they're plumper. And you know, the dryness of Capricorn, there can be this sort of hesitance, or yeah, again, even a sort of like masochistic pleasure in not having quite enough, like getting by with as little as possible, even if it would be a much more pleasant experience to let yourself have actually enough rather than the barest minimum.
What's seen as like almost a virtue to a certain extent, like that it's virtuous to live with less, and that it's to live with excess might be seen almost as like a sin or something in like a religious context. There's like a word for that, right? Like one of the 7 deadly sins.
Gluttony.
Yeah, gluttony.
Yeah.
I mean, back to the sustainability piece, like I think, and perhaps with folks of the, you know, the millennial generation with the Uranus and Neptune and Capricorn, that awareness, you know, from a very young age of the gluttony of consumerism, I think has been in the front of a lot of our minds, you know, as we've come of age. So you kind of notice in the consumer trends, I guess, since we've become more, you know, in the buying power in the market, the focus on sustainability products and whatnot is pretty huge. Or like, what are you doing? Are you doing your part to consume as little as possible? Like, have you taken a vow to produce no trash this year? Have you gone plastic free? Exactly.
Zero waste. Minimalism. Minimalism
Yes.
and zero waste are very Saturnian in like a Capricornian way, I would say.
Yeah. It's like the pleasure of knowing that you're not being part of the problem. Because I think part of Capricorn having, you know, both malefics have dignity in Capricorn. So there's almost that like fear of being malefic oneself. And so denying the self because you don't want to produce bad results. You know, you're almost working against that. You have so much awareness of the maleficence of life, or the possible negative outcomes of your consequences.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with the generational placement of Uranus and Neptune, and sometimes Saturn and Capricorn, and the sort of idealism and other things that come along with that. That's very specific to that subgeneration, and in terms of how they manifest the Capricorn archetype in that way.
This is reminding me that like our little subgeneration doesn't have the same relationship with the concept of tradition as people who have Capricorn placements without Uranus and Neptune also hanging out there, right?
Absolutely.
So, you know, tradition as another Saturn word, but also, you know, it's both Aquarian and Capricornian, I would say, because tradition, you know, it creates the structure of the worldview, but it also literally affects how people interact with materiality. You know, it's traditional to XYZ, but when you have Uranus and Neptune, it's like, is that necessary? Is that part of our ideals structure? Can we be building different ways of interacting with being alive?
Is this the right tradition?
Is
Are
it the correct
traditions?
one?
Yeah, I see the generation as really, you know, with Neptune and Capricorn, really craving an idealized sense of tradition. Or like, wouldn't it be so great if we had a society that actually did what it claims to do and supports, you know, everyone, supports people in meeting their basic needs.
Right.
So Uranus, you know, kind of seeing that and knowing that things have got to change because our systems, you know, aren't doing what they say they're supposed to do.
Right. It's like the structures of reality as they have existed so far have come to a kind of expiration date,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? But I would absolutely say, like, you know, Saturnian, Capricornian propulsion absolutely includes either the perpetuation of tradition or even the creation of new traditions in terms of how we're interacting with incarnate reality.
Mm-hmm. And even the desire to look back, I think, to older traditions, you know, to those of us who try to understand the traditions of the indigenous people, the traditional custodians of our land, or perhaps our ties to indigenous ancestors.
Right.
Like examples of human populations who were sustainable, who were able to perpetuate their culture for tens of thousands of years, and identifying what is it about those societies that we could perhaps reincorporate or reimagine as we try to make our own current social structure capable of lasting beyond, you know, the next 10 years.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That makes me think of keywords like elders, and also hierarchical structures in terms of like having somebody that's older and wiser and then passing that down to somebody as part of the generational transfer of wealth, not just through financial things, but also through the accumulation of knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah. Ancestry, honestly, is another thing that I would associate with both Saturn and Capricorn. Especially Capricorn, understanding that like our literal physical bodies are made of our ancestors. You know, it's like our DNA comes from the literal physical bodies of our ancestors. And then with ideas around it's like the land, quite literally being our ancestor, in that every single thing that we eat has attachments to the land ultimately. And then those component parts make up our literal physical forms. You know, so it's like the peach that I ate in August is one of my ancestors, and its ancestor is the land, and that like the land that particular peach tree grew on, and then its ancestors includes every single dead thing that contributed nutrients to that soil.
It makes me think of the tie-in with Venus ruling one of the other earth signs of Taurus. Venus is aware of relationships. And of course, like the pleasure of having a physical form, having a physical body, whereas the Saturn ruled earth sign is aware of, like you're saying, kind of like the legacy of relationships, the long lasting impacts of evolution, or of the work that we put in, you know, a year ago in order to grow a peach tree so that we might enjoy it now in the present moment.
Yeah, totally. Which reminds me actually of one of my favorite little sayings, which feels very Capricornian. It's like the best time to plant a fruit tree is 40 years ago. Yeah. And the next best time is now. This awareness that the best fruits come from mature trees, which means that you need to have patience and foresight in order to fully benefit from the labor that's put in.
That reminds me of the sort of the more malefic quality of Saturn ruling Capricorn is that, you know, regret, maybe regarding time, regarding effort not well spent. Just, you know, there's a lot of like self-flagellation that can go along with Capricorn, especially in, in a night chart, perhaps, where Capricorn is the more malefic, where, the regret or the depression, just not ever being able to meet those standards of achievement that Saturn might hope for with Capricorn.
Right.
That's really important. Having high standards is a huge Saturn thing and a huge Capricorn thing. And I've been trying to understand this over the past decade. It's been a thing I've been fascinated by, that part of it, because one of the things I've seen is like a superpower for Saturn and for Capricorn people sometimes, or people with heavy Capricorn placements, is the ability to see what's wrong with something, or to see the negative things in something, and the weaknesses, which can make them really excellent critics of things. But sometimes that criticism, which most often is visibly seen being projected outwards onto other things and other people, so that they're able to, like, similarly to Virgo in that way, like Virgo is able to see, the microscopic details and issues. Like Virgo can be, for example, very good at like proofreading a text and then just like seeing typos in it that other people might miss. Capricorn has a similar ability to do things, but to see the larger cracks in larger structures and the problems with them and the way that it could have been done better. But one of the problems is that sometimes that criticism, just as much as it's projected outwards and externally, it's also projected internally as a self-criticism. And sometimes one of the downsides with that can be inaction or an inability to do anything because it's not good enough or it doesn't meet up to their very high expectations. So sometimes people with those placements can, when they do produce something, it can take a while, but it will be of the highest quality because they do their very best job, not having any problems or errors or cracks in it. But other times when that tendency malfunctions, part of the malfunction is an inability to finish things or get things done because it's never quite good enough for them to like let it go and release it and finish that.
Yeah. Absolutely. The awareness of fault lines, if we're going to keep with the tectonic plate metaphors, absolutely as a Capricorn quality. Like I can see where the foundation is not going to be strong enough here, or it's like, it's good enough for now, but we are building in a place that has earthquakes. And so maybe we shouldn't build anything at all because at some point in the next 500 years, it's going to get destroyed. Almost too long of a vision, or like too long of a timeline getting incorporated into pretty immediate decision making. That awareness of consequences can be quite paralyzing.
Yeah, like the stagnation component of Saturn. Saturn representing things that can't, like, you can't move forward, you can't move past this line. I think that can really come in for Capricorn placements, like when they have set their expectations too high, almost like not being aware of their own limitations, like when it comes to like personal finances or personal mental health or even like physical ability. A Capricorn placement might be trying to achieve something that is beyond the limitations of their real reality. So that can be debilitating because you never are able to reach that goal. So it's almost like a process for Capricorns over their lifetime to like find those boundaries, like you're saying, like find those tectonic edges of like where's that sweet spot of like what I'm capable of doing and what I want to do. And
there's also something about resourcing with that of just like I should be able to do it with a quarter of a tank of gas. I don't need to buy gas, right? I don't need to spend money or I don't need to receive help or those sorts of things. Like I think that's one of the limitations that I've witnessed Capricorn come up against quite a lot, especially throughout like the time of everybody with Saturn and Capricorn going through their Saturn returns and observing a lot of that of just it's like you hit a wall not because that wall is permanent, but because you don't have the appropriate tools or resourcing to get over the wall. So if you give yourself the resources you need, you can get over the wall. And then there's a resistance to receiving or gathering those resources because it hasn't been earned, quote unquote, yet. Earning is a very Capricorn thing. I have to earn what X, Y, Z. And if I don't perceive myself to have earned it, then I don't deserve it, even though whatever it is actually exactly what you need to push past the limitations you're experiencing.
Yeah, Capricorn's very allergic to entitlement.
Yeah.
And that also that feels resonant in terms of like once we look at the relationship between Capricorn and Cancer, just that Capricorn placements reaching that limitation to where they do have to finally reach across the aisle and ask for someone with help taking care of some of the aspects of the project, like calling in the moon perhaps to take care of their physical self.
Ooh, I'm being reminded. So in the Thomas Taylor translation of the Orphic hymn to Saturn, Kronos, whatever, the word obstetric or the phrase obstetric nature gets used, which is reflected in the original Greek, but whatever. It's not, I don't speak Greek.
So what does that word mean? I don't
speak. Obstetric nature. So it's like obstetric, like of obstetrics, like an OBGYN, an obstetrics doctor is somebody
like
who
birthing.
Facilitates birthing. Exactly. Like bringing things into the world. And one of the things that I was just reminded of, especially with the Capricorn Cancer axis, is whenever people are pregnant, if they aren't consuming enough nutrients for both their gestating child and their own personal body. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on out there. But it's like they need to be consuming enough minerals and vitamins and macronutrients and things like that for both them and their child. If they aren't consuming enough like fats and minerals and things like that for both of them, the body prioritizes growing their child, which means that can lead to like perinatal osteoporosis and like neurological degeneration and things like that. And so there's a very tidy metaphor for Capricornian types of just prioritizing so much what is being built that there is a forgetting of the necessity of resourcing the self as the one doing the building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like there's that alienation from the self or from the body. Think of because of Capricorn being opposite to Cancer, which is, most the moon representing the body. It's like as far away as you can get from the needs of the body and the needs of the emotions, like the needs of that of the self.
the animal softness. Yeah,
exactly.
But also that's very frequently entirely what's necessary to not just self-sacrifice on the altar of your legacy, but participate in your legacy.
Yeah, get down into your body and into your relationships, or almost like who are you doing all of this for? Like if Capricorn is working towards something but is completely alone on their mountaintop, it's depending on the person, they might be into that, but often there is that craving for Cancer to have like some family, some people that you love that you can share your accomplishments with.
Yeah. Who was the legacy for?
Yeah.
Maybe this would be a good time to share the contrasts that Camille came up with for Cancer versus Capricorn. So I don't have a very good diagram for this, but let me just share the table from our written document. So these are the contrasts, like a table for those listening to the audio version of 2 columns. And we're going to compare Capricorn on the left and Cancer on the right. So Capricorn keyword is dry, and that's opposite to Cancer's keyword of wet, being an earth sign versus a water sign. Capricorn is the mentor versus Cancer is the mother. Capricorn is the world versus Cancer is the womb. Capricorn is earthly intelligence, whereas Cancer is emotional intelligence. Capricorn is to reason, Cancer is to intuit. Capricorn is firm, whereas Cancer is gentle. Capricorn is blood, sweat, and Cancer is the tears. Capricorn is to deny oneself, versus Cancer is to care for oneself. Capricorn is hard work, versus Cancer is heart work. And Capricorn is the provider, versus Cancer as the protector. Yeah, so a lot of good keywords there that tie into what you were both just saying.
That really points out there's this sort of archetypal or stereotypical like mommy daddy association with Cancer and with Capricorn, whereas Cancer as the archetypal mother is keeping its loved ones close to itself, or even keeping itself close and contained and protected, like nurtured and shielded. Whereas Capricorn is, out there earning the bread for the family. Or Capricorn is taking the children out of the nest and showing them, like, here's what you're actually going to have to deal with in the real world. Like it's time to, it's time to grow up and face the music. Like you have to leave the nest sometime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that actually reminds me quite directly of the image for Capricorn, like the mergoat, right? And some of the stories that get associated with that, and this idea of like you can't just stay in the ocean. You actually do have to come onto land.
I like that one story that I was reading though too about kind of the pain of Capricorn, like where the mergoat has Pricus has lost his children because they were all intelligent magical sea goats, but then his children eventually wandered onto the shores and basked in the sun and realized lost their ability to relate to him. And so in this story, the Pricus has the ability to turn back time, so he tries to turn back time so that he can prevent his children from leaving the sea and like leaving him all alone. But then he eventually gives up and realizes that there's no way to prevent this from happening. He is ultimately alone.
Yeah. That makes me think of and brings up a lot of what you're both saying right now, just that part of the interesting dynamic of the parents in astrology and the general planetary significators of the parents, that you sometimes default to like the sun representing the father figure versus the moon representing the mother figure. But also in traditional astrology, there were other alternative significators, which was Saturn and Venus. But it's interesting thinking about like the differences between the sun as the archetype for the father versus Saturn as part of the archetype for the father, or the different ways in which the role of that sort of fatherly or parental role can manifest sometimes in the Saturn or the Capricorn archetype.
Yeah, what's interesting is I personally resonate much more with Saturn as more of a grandmotherly figure, right? So still not a direct gestating parent, like still in this sort of like external, like of the world. There's like kind of like a worldly knowledge. There's like a wisdom component there. And the guidance around what does it mean to mature? What does it mean to grow up is a little bit more distant, in the same way that I think in a lot of the sort of binary ideas about father and mother, it's like mother is at home and like close with the children and father is out in the world. Like, there's that same sort of element with the grandmother. It's like the grandmother is a step removed from direct interaction with the baby, but is still a factor in helping that baby become an adult. And there's very much something about like Saturn as the one with external world, capital E, experience that might be a buzzkill a lot of the time, but it's a buzzkill that comes from experience, not just from protectiveness or something like that.
Yeah, the notion of there being some distance or coldness sometimes to that archetype seems important, though, because it seems like there's some kind of recurring theme there. And while that can be warmed up, sometimes just the notion that there's like a coldness or a distance to it, or an absence of some way, is kind of interesting in both the grandmother type archetype as well as distant father type archetype.
Even in looking at perhaps the difference between the sun as the father versus Saturn as the father, you could see the sun as sort of like the idealized father. So if you're paternal figure as someone that you would look up to and admire and think like, wow, I want to be just like him. Or, in one's personal chart, looking at the sun as perhaps how you've inherited, for better or for worse, traits of the father. Whereas Saturn could almost be like the absence of the father, or what do you do once the father is gone or no longer, say as you become older and the father isn't someone who is that like shiny solar symbol anymore. How are you taking care of yourself, or how are you meeting the needs that the archetypal father would have met earlier in life.
There's also something about Saturn as the provider of the structures.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of time, the structures of our life are the easiest things to take for granted. They don't necessarily feel directly like expressions of care or love, even if they are necessary for a continuance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you might not see the money coming into the bank account that buys the groceries. What you see is the groceries made into a meal on the dinner table.
Mm-hmm. And you literally might not even see the parent who's out there like earning the money.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have to be absent away from the home oftentimes in order to
do that.
Exactly.
To bring home the bacon, you have to be out in the field all the time.
Exactly.
That's really important because, without even getting into gender roles and things like that, there's sometimes the experience of one of the parents that is more of the harsh or the hard ass type, figure that set the rules or that went out and got the money and supported the family, even if they were then absent and therefore weren't able to play what was immediately experienced maybe early on as the nurturing role. But their nurturing was through like supporting the family or something like that. While we often have like recurring themes of that are associated with the father, maybe previously, that's something that easily can manifest in either parent figure, like those types of dynamics, it seems like at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like structurally present, but not emotionally available.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Cancer is there, being emotionally available, being, on call for meeting those immediate emotional and physical needs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's where we run into the moon having being opposite to its domicile in Capricorn and why that's sometimes associated as a challenging placement or one that at least is contrary to the moon because in Capricorn, maybe there's a coldness or an emotional coldness to a certain extent or a distance that's different than what the moon in Cancer is like or what its immediate impulse would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's interesting too is to think about how that distance can also be experienced as spaciousness, depending on the circumstances and depending on like the dynamics of the people involved. Right. So it's like Saturn gives you room. It might not be room that you want sometimes, right? It's like you're just, you're absent. And it's like, well, no, you have all this room to become yourself. Right. But when there can be that combination feeling of like, I wouldn't have become who I am if I'd been coddled. Right. And also it probably could have been nice to have more hugs. Like,
yeah, you need both. Right? Yeah. You don't want to be totally out in the cold, defenseless and alone. Just like how, the reason why infants cry, they're feeling that lack of, they're feeling alone. They're feeling like, like a Capricorn experience. Like, I'm not ready to be out there taking care of myself. Like, I still need nurturing and support and protection.
Yeah. Like this is reminding me of Saturn as Saturn and Capricorn, like Capricorn as the winter solstice point, right? Like that's when we enter Capricorn season, which is initiating the return of the sun, right? It's initiating this like coming back of light. And initiation experiences, like being pushed through a threshold, that often happens when you don't necessarily feel prepared for it. But that's also where you get the MacGyver resourcing capacity, right? Like there's very much a MacGyver quality to Capricorn of like, I'm going to make do with the materials that I have here available to me.
Right.
As best I can. Even if that's not I would rather have the easy way, maybe. But instead what I have to do is figure out how to just deal with this. And so even just thinking about, certain initiation experiences of like, you're out in the wilderness by yourself for 3 days. Hope you'll survive, kid. Right. And it's just like, but there's something about that is very maturing in significant ways and that you can't replicate if you're having your hand held the entire time.
It's like a training montage in a kung fu movie, really.
Yeah.
Like, okay, kid, you want to be the best. It's time to start climbing those, 1,000 staircases, balancing the water buckets on your back and all of that.
Mastery. Mastery is another Saturn and Capricorn word.
That's a really good one. That ties back into the desire to achieve the highest and to have the ability to see when things are not good and wanting to surpass that and wanting to like get to the top of something. And that would be a good keyword for that is mastery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, why not do it the best that it can be almost?
Yeah, so that and then that then ties back into the whole then sometimes inability, because I had a teacher, Robert Schmidt, who had 3 planets in Capricorn, and he would produce very high quality translations, but he got paralyzed sometimes in not putting out work and translations because he always wanted it to be the best, and that sometimes made it so he couldn't accomplish as much as he wanted to just because it held him back, not being able to just put out what he had at the time. And I think that's something as a Capricorn, Mars, and Jupiter that I've had to learn by observing that in different people. For example, in 2017, when I started, I'd done the audio podcast for 5 years of just like audio since 2012. And then in 2017, I wanted to get into doing video. And I tried to plan out some of it ahead of time, like with the podcast where I planned things like my structure of episodes. And you can see in like the very first episode, I had very grand plans for what I wanted to do in the podcast. But then when I started doing video versions, I realized I had to learn this whole new thing of doing video and getting the lighting right and shooting the audio at the same time and all this stuff. But there was a way in which I researched it as much as I could, but I realized I had to just start doing it because there's some things that you can only learn by doing them and by making mistakes and through trial and error. So I would like record a video, look at it, it would look and sound terrible, but then I would learn something from it like each time. And each time I would put out a new video every few days and look at it and see what was wrong with it and then try to fix just one thing each time. And in doing that, it made it manageable so that eventually it built up until I had like a heap of all of these videos and I could see my progress and you can track my progress. I don't recommend, so you can look back at the astrology podcast from like 2017. I don't recommend it because there's some very poorly shot videos from that time period if you want to laugh at that. But
it's all old timey and black and white with the
yeah, exactly.
motion.
Well, no, it's just like funny things. Like there'll be, I'll be at like the bottom of my head will be in the middle of the screen, but there'll be like 10 feet of just like feet above my of space above my head. And so a friend who shot video was like, yeah, your head should be closer to the top of the frame. And there's just like little things like that you don't think of until you do them. But it's like the alternative is to just become paralyzed by trying to anticipate and plan out all these things that are unknowable until you've actually like tried to do it. So that whole trial and error thing is very important, I think that's, yeah, it's tied in with a lot of different things related to Capricorn and the different dignity schemes. And that may be one of the reasons why Mars, I think, is said to do well there with its exaltation, because I think that gives it more of a push sometimes to just do it and just take the action and then learn from the mistake, as opposed to being crippled by trying to plan everything out ahead of time.
It feels like it speaks to the square or the relationship between Capricorn and Aries. Like, obviously, when you're saying just do it, there's such an Aries vibe to that. And the ways in which, Aries almost, I guess Aries benefits from Capricorn, but Capricorn also benefits from Aries. So sort of the way that they push each other with that, the drive to just make something happen is very Aries. But then the drive to maybe continue to refine that something rather than just like, oh, I did this thing and I wasn't good at it. Like I shot my video and it looked like crap. So forget it. I'm on to the next interest. The Capricorn, I think that's part of why Mars gets that exaltation, because Mars stops, shooting itself into new directions all the time and instead keeps that like gung-ho energy to just like, no, I'm going to do better next time. I'm going to do better next time. Yeah.
There's also something about Capricorn providing Mars with stuff to do, right?
Oh,
so it's
totally.
not just like focusing Mars. It's also like okay, I need these stones cut. Here's a pile of rocks and some sharp stuff to play with. Like, go do the thing. And there's also something about how Mars warms up Capricorn, right? Or like Capricorn cools down Mars enough for Mars to be functional, but Capricorn is in turn warmed up by the experience of Mars being present there. You know, just
the
like
confidence that Mars lends as well, maybe as part of the heat.
Yeah.
Because Mars just fucking loves winning. So it's just like, yeah, you know, I've got this grand vision and I'm gonna just make it happen.
Yeah.
No matter
it's
what
like let's fucking go, man. You know, and just like untouchable.
That 30-year vision, let's do it.
Yeah. Mars loves the competition and the drive. And can be the very much like, you know, shoot first, ask questions later, or the first into the breach. But Saturn and Capricorn gives it like that structure, that long-term structure that can help with success and help to guide Mars to be more successful than it might be otherwise, just shooting from the hip.
Absolutely.
I think it allows Mars to accept feedback too. Like Mars is less pointy, you know, being in a receptive sign and being in a sign that wants to you know, reach that high expectation. So Mars in Capricorn maybe finds that like, oh, I did something wrong, and is able to maybe take that in. I can be like, okay, so I don't want to miss the mark next time. So thank you for the constructive criticism. I'm going to, you know, next time I'm going to do it even more effectively.
Yeah, for sure.
And also, just Capricorn loves critical feedback.
As long as it's applicable.
True.
It needs to be pragmatic feedback and not amorphous feedback.
Yes. And as long as it hasn't already thought of it itself.
Right.
Like, oh, no. Believe me, I know what went wrong here.
I am aware of all of the fault lines. I don't need your observations about the fault lines. But if your observation is, you know, helps with the fault line, I guess it's
it's actually constructive. I haven't thought of it before, then absolutely.
And I don't know if it was kind of like an arrogant thing that came out like a month or two ago, but there was somebody that was like, I don't accept criticism from anybody that's doing worse than I'm doing. And that struck me as kind of like a little Capricorn-y sort of keyword at the time as well. Not that that's always going to be the recurring part of the archetype, or everyone's going to have that attitude, but I could see some versions of the archetype that would have that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, if you aren't where I want to go, why would I listen to you?
Very much like, you're not a role model for me.
Right. And it's also interesting to think about how that often contributes to that also asceticism dynamic with Capricorn, where it's just like the rejection of things that would be very nourishing because it's not immediately apparent to the Capricorn placement why it would be useful. Right.
Yeah,
it's just like
a cardinal sign, especially. It's like, I'm in progress. I'm working on something. Is this relevant to what I'm working on right now?
There's almost like this blinders thing of just like, that's the direction that I'm going in. Everything else is a distraction. Even if the other stuff is not actually a distraction, it's like, you need to fix your wheel. And it's just like, no, I'm moving in this direction and you're not going where I'm going. So why am I listening to you? And it's just like, bro, your wheel's going to fall off. Like, I don't need to be going where you're going to be able to see that your wheel is going to fall off.
So yeah, that's almost like where are the limitations of Capricorn and how can it benefit from the input of some of the other signs. That is reminding me of just like the Hermit archetype, you know, with Saturn having its joy in the 12th, like, so Saturnian types just having their joy in like a locked room somewhere where
isolation.
Not exactly
isolation as a relief rather than a punishment.
Exactly. Yeah, because of there's just less to manage, almost like that distance again from Cancer, which can be so busy meeting other people's needs or meeting emotional needs, that if Capricorn can distance itself from Cancer, be like, all right, no distractions, no one else's needs, just the work that needs to get done right now.
Yeah.
But then you're right, like when isolating itself, Capricorn can miss out on like the benefit of input from other people who have the perspective that they might be taking a blind eye to.
Can't see your own ass without a mirror.
That's why Leo is an aversion to Capricorn.
That's a good one. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Now you go.
No, it was going to be a transition away, so you should say.
No, that's what I was hoping for too. I was like, I think we need to get back to the structure.
Yeah, I don't have structure necessarily. We should take a break soon, but I did want to mention really quickly one chart example I had, which is always one of my favorite chart examples of this is J. Paul Getty, who had Capricorn rising and Saturn exalted in Libra in the 10th whole sign house, with Saturn ruling not just the ascendant, but also the second house of finances. And in like the 1950s, he was like an oil baron who in the 1950s, he was the richest man in the world, but he was like a famous workaholic and would just like work all the time. And he was also famously kind of stingy to a certain extent. For example, Wikipedia has this little sentence at the very top where it says, despite his vast wealth, Getty was famously frugal, notably negotiating his grandson's kidnapping ransom in 1973, which is that basically his grandson was like kidnapped, but he like famously like refused to pay the ransom and was like, no, I'm not going to pay that. And it was always one of my favorite examples.
So brutal.
Yeah. It's very
just not
brutal.
a good deal.
Yeah, he's like, can I get a coupon on that? Can we bring that price down? Or like trying to like negotiate. And I think it was actually terrible because I think they like ended up cutting off his like grandson's like ear or something like that. Like something.
God.
It was like real bad. So it's like funny, but also there can be really extreme versions of that and of that tendency of Saturn sometimes to withhold or Capricorn to like withhold things or hang on to things like so much. That's obviously a super extreme example, but frugal is a good keyword that I don't think we've used yet as a better, softer term for that, the financial part of that.
Yeah. And
yeah,
I feel
stingy on the downside, frugal on the upside.
On the upside.
Yeah.
And there's so many variations of that. So, I think about there's this, I forget who first said it, but it's just like we're too poor to buy cheap shoes. This idea of, frugal isn't just about buying the cheapest thing. That's like stinginess. Stinginess is what's the cheapest possible. Frugality includes the considerations of the long term, right? So it's like, you save up your money, you buy the highest quality pair of shoes that you can afford that also, has the most broad usefulness. And you take it to the cobbler to get them repaired. And, you replace the shoelaces when they break, all of that kind of thing. It's like over the lifespan of that pair of shoes, you're going to have spent much less money than if you just bought the cheapest pair possible that falls apart immediately. And then you have to replace them constantly.
Yeah. By the thing that will last.
By the thing that lasts, by the thing that you can repair, by the thing that once it's no longer repairable, you can recycle into a different use, right? So it's like you buy the high quality linen shirt and you wear it to death and you repair it to death, and eventually that becomes your rags and you use that to clean your house. And eventually the rags are too raggedy, so you put them in the compost heap because you bought a natural fiber that will decompose in your compost heap. That's the long form positive variation of Saturnian frugality.
It's almost like a long term cycle too, like thinking of the moon as rolling the short term cycles, and so it's opposite. Saturn is more like can I see the logical conclusion of everything, but of any particular item? What is the full? What's
its life cycle, and then the death cycle too. Like if you can own a particular object from start to finish and beyond, like that's a Capricornian experience, I would say.
Totally. And definitely the pleasure in making things last, like taking small, like the tiniest bits of resources and then stretching them as far as they can go. Like my husband loves to tell a story of like the first road trip we took together where I had like not finished a cucumber or something like that. Like I had maybe 3 slices of cucumber left in my little snack bag. And he's just like, and you saved them. You saved them for later. And then later on that day, like you pulled out the 3 slices of cucumber and it was great. Like we really, like we enjoyed that snack at that time. And I go, that's right. Always save your leftover snacks. Like, come on.
You got to get the tiny Tupperware so that you can save the like 2 tablespoons of salad dressing because you will eat it later.
Exactly. You will use it later.
Yeah.
That's funny. So that gets into, prolonging the life of something gets into another aspect of the Capricorn archetype that often is brought up, which is the idea of like aging in reverse sometimes, or like those who are born very old or exhibit traits that we might associate with somebody that's older or more serious than their age, like relatively young, versus somebody that almost seems to get younger or to age really well, to age in reverse in some ways. So Camille wrote in the notes that Capricorn can be inflexible, rigid, and can take life a bit too seriously. Although it's said that with time and age, Capricorn energy ferments, gets looser, more childlike, the Benjamin Button syndrome. Not always guaranteed, but it implies that the early life of Capricorn may be more responsibility heavy. But that is certainly something with just Saturn in general, that Saturn does tend to get better with age.
Yeah. Anything that gets better with age is Saturnian. Yeah, it's a Saturnian quality. And I can say that for myself. People thought that I was a solid 4 to 5 years older than I was until I hit like 26 or so. And then people got closer. When I hit my Saturn return, people were pretty good at guessing how old I was. And now people think I'm younger than I am. Also, I had crow's feet when I was like 24 and they went away.
Interesting.
Okay. So
the blessing
the reverse
of having Venus in the first.
I mean, yeah, it's like dignified Saturn in the first and dignified Venus in the first, plus like well thought out and sustainable skincare regimen. Right? Like we're doing the slow-mo elegant aging rather than like the easy answer, like, you know, Botox or whatever people might do. It's like, I don't want the easy answer. I want the thing that I can do at home for a minimal amount of money. One of my tools is a gua sha, which is a stone tool for ensuring that the health of your connective tissue is Saturnian, and your skin is Saturnian, is durable Saturnian.
It's beautiful.
I love
like
it.
that.
Yeah.
That feels like it kind of ties into the relationship with Libra, where like, you know, what are the things that Capricorn and Libra share in common and where do they differ? And Saturn having its exaltation in Libra, like there's this ridiculous amount of like discipline and determination that goes into high Libra ideals of, you know, like the beauty, you know, in order to attain perfected beauty, one must have a disciplined skincare routine, for instance.
Yeah. You're doing the like Patrick Bateman like skincare routine at the beginning of each day.
It's not that
bad. Okay. All right. Going back to the age thing though, because that brings up one of my chart examples, which is I think of like Tiger Woods and just you know, he has Virgo rising and Mercury in Capricorn in the 5th house, along with the Sun obviously in a night chart, and you know, it's in the 5th house of like games, but he literally like grew up playing. You can see these videos of him just being super young and being taught golf by his dad, and just like from a very early age, like playing that game over and over again and developing a mastery of it. But also in that, maybe not having as much of a childhood or not having the same sort of childhood that other people his age had, because he was taking this game, which became, you know, I guess his life's work, much more seriously. That's, I think, a good image for Capricorn in terms of that like reverse aging thing, or that being older than your years, or sometimes wiser beyond your years.
Yeah. One thing that is very consistent in my client sessions with especially Cap risings, but Aquarius risings to a degree as well, is the experience in childhood of having to be an adult, right? Not necessarily choosing to be an adult, but being kind of forced into precocious levels of maturity. And then once they are actually in adulthood, like there's very consistently like people will have a light bulb moment of like, oh, I'm not responsible for anyone except myself. And so that means I can do what I want
It becomes
instead of
much easier.
do what I have to do. Right. Yeah. Like for me, it was the moment where I was just like, oh, I'm a grown up. I can have brownies and wine for dinner whenever I want. Right. Like, you know, whatever that might be. It's just like this sort of recognition that you don't have like your entire household's like, you know, stability on your shoulders anymore because you don't live there anymore. So you can do
it's
what
almost
you want.
important to have that experience of being alone or being on your own. Almost like you can imagine some Capricorn experiences where you might transition from being a serious child with a lot of responsibility straight into being a serious young adult with a lot of responsibility. And so do you give yourself the chance to have some enough alone time to kind of sort out your priorities and your responsibilities?
Yeah.
Or does it take until, maybe the first Saturn return?
Or the second Saturn return for some folks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And perhaps in that Saturnian way, something is taken away from you or you're denied something falls apart. And then you maybe realize, like, is XYZ worth the effort that you've been putting into it?
I feel like people who really, really, really love retirement, who just go all out, like hardcore, basically, partying at the, oh man, what's that restaurant chain? Oh man, it's like a restaurant chain for people who really liked this specific singer. I'm not going to remember it right now, but it's, you know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like Margaritaville.
Yeah, Margaritaville. Like, right? Yeah. It's just like
Jimmy
the people.
Buffett.
Jimmy Buffett. Exactly. Yeah. Right. It's like they're going all out at the Margaritaville. Like, they're in their retirement communities having their wild parties. Like that is such a good example of like that Saturnian Benjamin Button syndrome, where it's just like we were the serious adults who fulfilled our responsibilities. Our kids have left the nest. They have their own lives. We don't we retired from the company, like we have our pensions, whatever. And now we're just going to have the time of our lives before we're done being alive. Right. That would be like the second Saturn return version of the Benjamin Button experience, I would say.
Yeah. And being able to reap the rewards from having, put away money or done stuff earlier to be in like a good position later on. Although there's some people though, when I think about Capricorn that are the perpetual people that keep working even into old age. Like I'm looking at some of my private files right now, and just like people who work is what they love doing, or that they've always worked so that it's something they continue to do even relatively late in life, to keep focusing on that.
Yeah. It's like either completely leaving work behind and being a kid, or, my work is my life. So why would I retire?
Right. And almost like identifying that or finding their identity in that to some extent.
That cardinality again, just like needing to do stuff. Is a big factor.
I'm reminded of my grandmother, who's a very solid Capricorn, who after she retired was just volunteering all the time. All the time. It's only now like in her very late 80s that she's calmed down with the having somewhere to go almost every day.
Okay.
Because there's sort of that relationship again with Virgo of like usefulness, like needing to be useful. Maybe like having a little bit of that fear of idle time, or just having an awareness of all of the possible effects that one's actions could have. So that like, I'm not going to rest because like I could be using my time and energy to do to help other people, or to serve or something.
I don't want to waste my time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
every good Capricorn is just like the thought of wasted time makes them puke in their mouth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially if somebody else is wasting our time. If we waste our own time, we'll flagellate ourselves. But if somebody else wastes their time, that's
just time to walk away. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Although I will say, as someone with the night chart Saturn in the first, the wasting my own time is much scarier. It's like,
okay, fair.
I should have been more responsible.
Yeah.
And one last example to round off the time and the older younger thing is you'd both mentioned and Camille had mentioned as a chart example, Greta Thunberg, who has the sun, probably the moon, and Mercury in Capricorn. We don't have a birth time for her, but she's somebody that became an environmental rights activist, like extremely young, and became prominent and known for that relatively early in her life, being only born in like 2003. And then when did she come to prominence? It was like several years ago now at this point, right?
I feel like she was like 14 or something.
Yeah.
Probably at the Saturn opposition, like around that age.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It says in August, Wikipedia says that in August 2018, at age 15, she started spending her Fridays outside of the Swedish parliament to call for stronger action on climate change, as most normal 15-year-olds do, spending their days outside of parliament, lobbying parliament to make changes. To
be responsible.
Right.
Specifically to be responsible.
And kind of like shaming them. Like she like went to the UN or something at one point. It was kind of like shaming people for not being responsible or like not taking care of the world and things like that. It says she initially gained notice for her youth and her straightforward and blunt speaking manner, both in public and to political leaders and assemblies, in which she criticizes world leaders for their failure to take what she considers sufficient action to address climate change. They're all very like Capricorn-y keywords.
Yeah, and she has that mutual reception between Mercury and Saturn, right? Like Saturn and Gemini with Mercury and Capricorn. So there's very much that like communicating from a place of can you not see what is really happening?
Like we have the information, we have the facts. We don't need to do any more, we don't
have to do research. We have to do action.
Yeah, enough talking about it. Like, why aren't we doing it? Yeah, I think that bluntness is another good kind of keyword for Capricorn, which is just like not sugarcoating the truth, not putting a positive spin on things, just going like, from her perspective, she's like, I'm on the precipice of adulthood. I'm being told that we have like no viable future for humanity. What gives?
Yeah. Which reminds me that bitterness, like both in terms of like taste, like actual taste, but also just like the consequences, like sometimes Saturnian consequences or Capricornian consequences lead to bitterness. Right. So like a bitter statement of just like, you are fucking up my future. What are you doing? Why are you just like sitting on your ass, like saying pretty words to each other without actually taking care of what you're responsible for? Like that, the intensity, it's not the rage, like the hot, fiery rage. It's very much that bitter, like cold fire anger.
Like, I guess you guys are just waiting for the next generation to get to work. Like, you're going to continue to sit there and talk about it, and it is ultimately going to be up to us. And so many more decades will have passed by the time.
You're wasting our time.
Exactly.
By doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We see you, Greta. We see you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just looking at her. She has Mercury stationary retrograde at 28 Capricorn, and that's so funny.
So this retrograde is echoing for her.
Exactly, and she was just like in the news because Mercury just stationed. Like this isn't going to be very timeless for this episode, but
it was a sweet burn, though.
It was a sweet burn. She made this. There was like this misogynist Andrew Tate who like tried to post a tweet like saying something like to her that I own 33 cars, and he was like bragging or something, or trying to take her on as a climate activist and just be a jerk.
He's like, give me your email address so I can show you even more cars.
Just like being skeezy and terrible.
Yeah. And her response was like, yes, please enlighten me. You can email me at smalldickenergy@getalife.com.
Right.
And then him and his like childish response owned himself and ended up getting himself arrested.
Which kind of speaks to the Saturn keyword of karma, or the logical ramifications of one's actions.
Right. It's just like this isn't, it's not punishment, it's just the results of what you did.
Exactly. Yeah, like she didn't call the cops on you.
Right.
Yeah. You did it to yourself.
Yeah, but that was pretty good, and it was pretty short burn, like using the least amount of words possible, just responding pretty brutally. So that's funny. Funny story. Shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the astrology software program that we use here on the podcast called SolarFire. SolarFire is one of the most popular programs that astrologers use to calculate charts. It has the ability to calculate hundreds of different techniques, and you can also use it to animate charts and move them forward and backward in time. You can get a 15% discount on SolarFire by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase the program through the Astrolabe website at alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend a program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which was made by the creators of SolarFire and includes a number of modern and ancient techniques, as well as the ability to animate charts. Get a 15% discount on AstroGold by using the promo code AstroPodcast15 when you purchase the program through their website at astrogold.io. Finally, if you're looking to get an astrological consultation with a professional astrologer, check out our new recommended astrologers page on the podcast website at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers listed on our page when you use the promo code astrologypodcast. All right, let's go ahead and resume from our break. Really quickly, I have to mention part of the anecdote, because everyone's going to forget about this probably in a month, but that we were talking about the Greta Thurnberg thing, because then the guy she responded to ended up getting arrested like a day or two later, and he's like sitting in jail right now. So, and there's been speculations about whether her response and then his really pathetic response back to her was part of the reason why the authorities knew where he was and then arrested him for some potentially terrible things that he is accused of doing. So anyways, I just wanted to wrap that up in terms of that little thing. We were just talking about like the recurring joke on the podcast, #astrologer good, when like transits are like so bad, but you're just so impressed by the astrology that it's almost like the it's a little positive note on things would make things otherwise not completely good. And you were talking about how maybe that's part of what Capricorn loves about astrology or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Capricorn just loves that sense that that time does have meaning for one. And that, and again, like the time boxing of being able to just like divide and subdivide every moment of life into sections of compartmentalized time, like perceiving one's life as like a tiny subsection of a Pluto cycle versus a couple of Saturn cycles versus nearly infinity moon cycles.
Yeah, or maybe being able to plan things out in the future with like electional or something like that.
Absolutely, having that confidence that like now is the good time or now is not the good time. I think it's almost therapeutic for Capricorn to work with astrology.
Yeah, especially I feel like the longer cycles, like the long view, and demarcations of limitations is also very helpful. To be able to say, this is a transit that I'm experiencing right now, and I can describe what it is describing in my own life, and I can clearly see where the end point is for this specific transit. And whether that's for good or for ill, of just like, I need to take advantage of this moment because like the grass, like the grain is really ripe and juicy and there's plenty of it. So I need to harvest as much as I can. Or from the standpoint of, this is a necessary period of austerity, or this is a great time to not try hard in that particular area of life. Like, because it's not favorable, it's just like, okay, it'll stop being not favorable in 2 weeks or 6 months or whatever. Really facilitates the pursuit of pursuit of things, but like in tandem with a clear time structure.
Yeah, that you need to use time to plan things. That time is like an integral component to things and knowing when to do things or when not to do things.
To use time wisely, to not waste time, is facilitated by understanding the qualities of time as currently described by current astrological weather.
Yeah, and the lengths of those periods, like knowing the end date and the start date.
Yeah.
And that even feels like it gets into like, Capricorn and Aquarius rising as being the people who are ruled by Saturn, or who's, if your ruling planet is the slowest moving visible planet, what does that mean to the native in terms of how like it naturally would focus on the long term versus those natives who are ruled by faster moving planets? Like you look at what is your ruling planet going to be doing, for the coming year. You're like, oh, it's continuing to focus on the same thing it was doing last year.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an encouragement to do longer term planning just because your ruling, like your ascendant ruler is always doing longer term work. So to be able to structure every 30-year chunk of life by where Saturn currently is hanging out, like, wow, that's like so handy. Just like, okay, Saturn enters Leo, like, what are you focusing on for 3 years? What's what's the core understructure for those 3 years?
And having that heads up to, like, as we go into 2023, like as this episode is being recorded, we know that Saturn is changing signs in tropical astrology in March. And so folks with an eye to Saturn are able to prepare for that transition. Yeah. Which feels really good. If you imagine being a Saturn native out there in the wild, not knowing astrology, you would be less able to
feel much more like a victim of circumstance and time rather than a participant in circumstance and time.
Yeah, we all remember life before astrology. It was so harsh.
Well, and it's been a long 6 years of Saturn transiting through its own signs of first Capricorn from like 2017 to 2020, and then Aquarius from 2020 to 2023. So I was talking to Patrick Watson yesterday, and we were talking about that transition of Saturn into Pisces, moving into a Jupiter-ruled sign for the first time since 2016, 2017, and he was saying that it's really felt the past like 6 years like a long extended winter in some ways, with everything that's happened, obviously in terms of the pandemic, but other things as well.
I wonder if we'll get the next Game of Thrones book, because winter has come and gone.
Yeah.
The next Game of Thrones book, spring is coming.
Yeah.
The dream of spring. Well, that's a great Capricorn phrase or keyword then, that winter is coming. That's the House Stark's like motto in Game of Thrones. It's a very Capricorn.
House Stark is so Capricorn, I can't even deal with it. Like so immensely Capricorn, always planning for winter. Like even in the height of summer, planning for winter.
They're out there at like the boundary of the territory too, like
right. But they're on this side of the wall. Like the wildlings are a little bit more Aquarius, right? Yes. But like the Starks are Capricorn, tradition, structure, family. Family is everything. Integrity is everything. Like the downfall of the Starks throughout Game of Thrones is adhering so tightly to their own extremely high standards of behavior, even when everybody else is fucking around and finding out.
Which really naturally leads into that. Like we haven't talked about the Aquarius as the reaction to Capricorn. It's like two sides of Saturn that are so similar and so different at the same time.
Before we get there, one last keyword to wrap up this section that I just came up with based on our previous discussions, but I realized it's got to be one of the umbrella terms is to conserve. And I think that really helps because it can be like to conserve energy, to conserve resources in many different ways. And, that works as a super high level archetype keyword because there's many different ways then that can manifest in different constructive or negative or even neutral ways, but it seems like that's one of the overarching themes we keep coming back to, is the notion of like Capricorn and the idea of to conserve something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost like during Sagittarius season where there may be lots of holidays and feasts occurring. Capricorn is, sitting there like quietly stowing away some of the resources so that, once the party's over, we can actually last through the next 3 months or however many months according to that geography of lean times.
Yeah, and it's always been a little, I think sometimes people think about and wonder about this in terms of like Christmas and whatever previous Roman holidays it's based on, what Saturnalia being around the time of the winter solstice. But I was thinking about that one point and thinking about how you can only have that sort of like winter feast in the middle of winter if you've done a good job of like building up storehouses of food during the summer. And if you didn't, then you're not really having much of a feast.
Yeah, you have to know how much you can indulge.
Right.
You have to put in, celebrating the hard work, I suppose. Which is that's sort of a key phrase, I guess, with Capricorn, like delayed gratification.
Absolutely.
Just putting off, indulgence until you know for sure that it's safe to indulge.
Yeah.
Are there any chart examples that either of you would like to mention or that you like to use for Capricorn before we move into this section, just talking about the comparison with the different signs?
I mean, I love Dolly Parton. I love Dolly Parton. Like,
for somebody that doesn't know Dolly Parton, how do you relate that?
Well, Cap, Sun, Venus, Mercury, all in the 5th. And her career is one of the most long-lasting careers of any musician kind of ever. And she has been very clearly herself the entire time, right? So it's like ascendant ruler in the 5th, with that Virgo rising.
Okay.
And then what's also interesting is that Saturn-Mars conjunction right across the street from her Mercury, Venus, Sun. So the balance of Cancer and Capricorn is like baked into like how she presents herself and the impacts that her music has and the impacts of her money, right? Like she is someone who has taken the resources that she has gathered to help children, 5th house, right? Like she's a huge like pro-literacy person, gives out lots of books, supports lots of libraries in the South. There's a generosity and a staying power simultaneously. She's also been really, really, really good at continuing to own her own shit, right? So like in time periods when there were a lot of musicians being deeply taken advantage of, she didn't experience as much of that, in part because she was so locked in on what she knew was hers. So that conservation component, like I'm conserving my own resources, and I'm going to be very generative with those resources, establishing very substantial legacies while doing so.
That's good. I like that.
Yeah.
Madeline, do you have any good chart examples you wanted to do?
Yeah, I just I recently saw the play Hamilton, like way delayed, as it were. I was trying to decide if it was worth the money.
Capricorn jokes.
I was like, oh, my mom will really enjoy it, so I'll spend the money because she'll enjoy it.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's quality entertainment. I think it's worth seeing. But I was very curious, of course, as an astrologer watching this play about just like, oh, what kind of natal placements did Alexander Hamilton have? So there's not a timed birth, obviously, but there's a date of birth, and so he has a Capricorn stellium with like a Sun-Saturn conjunction. I think Mercury as well, and possibly I think the Moon is solidly in there, like within that 12-hour or that 24-hour span, rather. So in that play, they're just going on and on about his archetype as being someone who's like instrumental in the foundation of building the nation that will be the United States, and how he has sort of like a rags to riches story. Like he starts off very poor, and then finds his goal, finds his focus, and they even talk about like he's this mastermind of the financial system that goes into the founding of the United States. Of course, this is speculative, but you get the impression from the story that he's a very mercurial person. He does so much writing and communications. So you speculate that perhaps that Capricorn stellium is in the 2nd or the 8th house, one of the financial houses. So being a founding father of the treasury was interesting to me.
Wow, that's so good.
I was like, in the play, I'm just like, he's probably a Gemini rising or maybe Sag rising, and then you look it up later. I'm like, oh, well, then that would put Mars in his, perhaps in the 1st, and he's a very martial person. Just doing that super astro geek thing where you try to listen to all the key points in their life story, and
it's also hilarious that the musical, which is Venusian, was happening while transiting Saturn was in that section of his chart.
Absolutely.
Right? Like
the Capricorn section.
Yeah.
Because he has that Venus Sun conjunction as well.
Didn't it come out? Wait, I may be getting this wrong.
It was a little bit early. I think it came out in the
while Saturn was in Sag
era.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm speculating that he could be Sag rising.
Right.
Anyway.
Hilarious.
So in the musical, he's like, I'm not gonna lose my shot. He's very that Mars and Sag, just like, I've got a vision, I'm gonna go after it. I want to be on the front lines.
So good.
For the audio listeners, with the date of birth, he's got Mercury, probably the Moon, Saturn, Sun, and Venus all in the sign of Capricorn. It's a pretty good stellium. All right.
What's your favorite Capricorn chart, Chris?
I have him. I'm trying to pull up the chart right now. So my favorite that I've used for years is James Earl Jones, who we have
Darth
a birth
Vader
time
himself.
So the voice of Darth Vader, but then he has an interesting backstory related to that.
Right?
Yeah, Mufasa too.
And Mufasa, yeah.
Big Daddy energy.
In the Lion
Big
King.
Daddy energy.
Yeah, and save that because I want to come back to that, because that's an archetypal theme we need to come back to yet that we haven't before. But so he has the ascendant. We have a time birth chart for him, and he has what is probably a night chart. He was born a little bit before sunrise with the ascendant in Capricorn, as well as Mercury, which is stationing on his day of birth, basically. It's stationary, as well as the Moon, Saturn, and the Sun and the Lot of Fortune, all in Capricorn. So for the audio listeners, just imagine somebody with like a big Capricorn stellium involving a lot of personal planets, including Saturn, and then having his rising sign like also be there, so that all that's in the 1st house. So funny thing about him is that he had some speech issues when he was really young. He had a stutter, or he developed a stutter, which was so severe that for several years he refused to speak. So like if you go on his like Wikipedia entry, it says at one point in an interview, it says, quote, "I was a stutterer. I couldn't talk. So my first year of school was my first mute year. And then those mute years continued until I got to high school." So he literally like wasn't speaking for like this huge chunk of his life early on, and was experiencing actual issues with communication or great challenges with communication. But then eventually he was able to overcome this, and eventually he got into acting. And he said that poetry helped him to like overcome this stutter. And then it's so ironic because then, as we all know, or at least most of us in our generation know, once he became an adult, he ended up being the voice, the famous voice of like Darth Vader, and then also like the voice of Mufasa in The Lion King. And he just had this big, like commanding, sort of like booming voice that became very iconic as he got older. And there's something about that that's so striking and so perfect as a Saturn example of, having an issue or a challenge early on in life, but eventually being able to overcome that to the point that it becomes actually a strength, where what was initially like a sore spot or shortcoming eventually becomes like almost like your superpower in a way.
So good. And it makes me wonder if his first year of school might have been like his applying Saturn square. And if his like release from muteness would have been in the aftermath of his Saturn opposition, like his first Saturn opposition, which was also very close to his natal Jupiter. And so just even this thought of like not only de-restricting, but it becoming big, like this big voice. Oh.
Totally.
I love that too, the archetypes that we're referencing. Moment for the astrologer good.
Beautiful. It's
so satisfying.
Yeah.
But so those archetypes of like Darth Vader and Mufasa, it reminds me of what I was trying to convey about Saturn as a paternal figure versus the sun as a paternal figure, because both of those father figures, those roles it's like a father who is missing or who is taken away for whatever reason. Especially Darth Vader as being like, it's my father, but also it's my arch nemesis.
Right.
Yeah, that he's a bad guy, and then you find out that you're related to the bad guy.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also something like with Mufasa, like Mufasa's absence, like doesn't actually diminish the sensation of Mufasa's presence, right? Like Simba kind of lives in the shadow of his father.
Absolutely. But even just that feeling of like, oh, the king is dead, that vibe that the Lion King is trying to convey, that's such a Saturn.
Yeah.
What do you do when, when the ruler or the icon, the person that you look up to, the literal God figure of the sun is gone? What do you do then? You gotta, put on your big boy pants and go save Pride Rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even I know when Saturn comes up, a lot of people talk about like the famous archetypal stories and like Greek myths about like Saturn devouring his son, and that famous painting and some of the things like that, and the dynamic between sometimes parents and children and the generational tensions.
Yeah,
perhaps like a negative Capricorn trait of wanting to hold on to the structure that maybe one's worked hard all their life to create, and so the next generation threatens that structure.
Right. I mean, and even like the story of Precus of not actually letting, like trying to like turn back time. If I could turn back time, right?
If I could find a way.
Just like stealing his children back to the sea, just being like, no, you don't get to be born. You have to come back here with me. And then even like turning that into something more of a metaphor is just like the way that Capricornian folks can do such a good job at not sharing their creations, right? At not completing and then birthing their creations and allowing their creations to actually exist in the world as their own things, right? It's just like, oh no, it's not good enough. I'm just going to eat it. I'm just going to eat it and pretend it never happened. Yeah.
And generationally attempting to maintain the status quo, or that actually brings up one of the things that always happens with society is that we often people are often always either idealizing like the past or idealizing the future. We're either looking back to the good old days when everything was perfect and when blah 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 XYZ and was happening, and how that's over idealized, or always looking at the future where that the future is going to be great and all the problems are going to be solved and everything's going to be different, as well as the classic the youth is ruining society trope that's been going on, that we have records going back like thousands of years about people in like Athens in like the 5th century BCE like complaining about how the youth is like ruining everything and they don't respect their parents anymore, and all of the traditions are being forgotten about and neglected, and society obviously is just going to end any time now because of how the youth is doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And like as you're saying that, I'm also being reminded of the concept of the golden age of Chronos, right? Like the golden era, prior to the rise of the Olympians. And it's just like, yeah, there's like endless time because we don't have Olympians trying to use the time. You know, time is not constrained by the aims of whatever you can understand the Olympians to symbolize. It's just endless time, man. Uncaged time. All time is free time because time is free. That sort of utopian golden age, rose-colored glasses look on the past. And I would say, you know, if we're gonna like contrast signs at all, it's like Aquarius is maybe a little bit more of that future-oriented, like the eyes are on the traditions of the future rather than the nostalgias of a fantasized past.
I think that's totally correct. That's totally right. And that maybe that's the contrast, is the Saturn tends to be, or Capricorn is more perhaps backwards looking to some extent. I mean, obviously there's long-term planning impulses and other things like that, but Aquarius being a bit more future oriented and future looking.
I feel like the Capricorn long-term planning is I want to be able to look back and say that I did it.
Yeah.
Whereas
totally.
like the Aquarius long-term planning is like, I want to see what's happening then and I want to build what I want to be happening then rather than the sensation of I want to look back and be able to be proud of how I used my time.
Totally. That's perfect. So eyes on the future versus eyes on the past.
I think Aquarius as an air sign too is just like very happy to be in the theoretical, to, you know, just to envision the future and, you know, work on something that can create this theoretical, you know, better structure. Whereas because Capricorn is the Earth Saturn, is so hyper aware of what currently exists or working with what's right in front of you. That creates that strong contrast in the archetypes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more of a social component because Aquarius is an Earth sign. Just looking back at our diagram here, and the other Earth signs are like, you know, Gemini.
Oh, air signs?
Or sorry, yeah, thank you. Air signs are Gemini, and it's like communicativeness, or Libra with Venus and the socialness of that. And then you get to the third air sign, which is Saturn, which, you know, being traditionally ruled by Saturn and being a cold sign, we would think that it's, you know, just a continuation of Capricorn in a sense, but being an air sign, it brings in this informational or communicative or to some extent like a social component.
Yeah, it's almost, I mean, it's interesting how Aquarius coming after Capricorn is like Saturn reacting to itself, like Saturn trying to improve on how it was just doing things and maybe recognizing the limitations of the earthly plane, the limitations of what has been created before.
Right. There's also something about how actions participate in the creation and reaffirmation of beliefs. I think about Aquarius quite a lot in terms of belief structures and worldview structures, right? These sort of intangible structures that actively participate in our perception of tangible reality, right? And so it's like, how is it that altering or creating tangible reality changes our beliefs and understandings about what is reality?
You almost, I mean, like once you're in Aquarius, you then have a sextile to Sagittarius. So you're able to welcome Jupiter back into your life.
There's a warm up.
Exactly.
Like,
okay, Sagittarius. Yeah. I'm hearing your ideas. Now let's come up with some plans to make them happen. And perhaps utilizing technology, we can make Aquarius being so associated with technological innovations. Like perhaps we can accomplish a lot more than we could have with Capricorn, where we were just focusing on, you know, moving the earth.
Right. We don't have to hand cut every stone for the building. We can use our tools to cut the stones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Be like, no, but I love my hand-cut tools, the Capricorn older generation.
Handmade is the best way.
Yes. It's like, it may be true, but think of how many more people are going to be able to have tools if we, improve this process a little bit.
Yeah.
That's such a great point, because I've been thinking about that so much over the past month since we did the year ahead forecast. And since we're getting to that third decan and Saturn's making its final run through the end of Aquarius at this point, and we're just seeing the results of all this technological innovation that's been in development and brewing over the past 3 years, that Saturn's been transiting through the first parts of Aquarius. And now a lot of it's just coming to the forefront really rapidly, including things like artificial intelligence. And that one of the main themes with that seems to be either humans using that or using technology in general to enhance what they do, or enhance their abilities to accomplish things, or in other instances that it's being used in order to replace things that we do. But that notion of technology in Aquarius enhancing things and enhancing the work that you do, that's more grounded and practical, just based on what you have at your disposal, or that you have with your inherent abilities and skills with Capricorn. But then, in Aquarius, you try to find ways to leverage other tools that you can invent or come up with that can help you do things faster or more effectively.
Yeah, I feel like efficiency would be a word I would apply to Aquarius, where it's like, where Saturn in Capricorn, or Capricornian Saturn, might be more about the conservation of resources and energy and things like that. Aquarian Saturn is more like, it's not about conserving, but using what we have efficiently.
And being able to distribute it, that air sign, being able to distribute the tools and resources so that more people can contribute, so that it becomes even more efficient.
Yeah. Is it networked, or is it solitary?
Yes. There's that aspect to Aquarius that is also solitary, or that is like hermit-like, where perhaps similarly, like in their youth, they might be isolated in terms of having that vision of what needs to change about society, or what, being so, enamored with maybe tools or technology that they don't socialize as much, or socialize from a distance, like from the safety of, behind their computer screen or whatnot. So sharing that kind of like that isolation quality with Capricorn, but then using it towards reaching out into society with their impact.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to think about how both Capricorn and Aquarius they're like dry in different ways, right? But there's like rigidity in both of them. And it's like material rigidity versus conceptual rigidity, right? And it's like, even, where they're like the high standards of Capricorn, or maybe like the high standards of achievement, whereas the high standards of Aquarius are more about high standards, philosophically or definitionally, right?
Yeah,
or even like a moral or ethical high standard.
It's like material rigidity versus intellectual rigidity.
Yeah, totally. And even the like the burden of responsibility that Capricorn feels, I think Aquarius also feels, but towards the means of like I've got to enact my ideas, like how I see the world, or my ideas about society are so important and useful that almost becomes the burden that they carry.
It's the responsibility of ideals versus the responsibility of legacy.
There's also a continuation to some extent of Capricorn's ability to say no, or to criticize things, and in that way to kind of critique or reject things. We see that in Aquarius, but more in terms of social conventions, where Aquarius doesn't mind, or sometimes just naturally like stands out and is unique or weird compared to whatever the norm is, or whatever the standard is, but it can sometimes like fully, that in and of itself, that being unique is partially sometimes through a rejection of social convention, or saying no to something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I almost think about how the nocturnal signs ruled by malefics, like Scorpio and Capricorn, might be reacting to having been rejected, or having been forced to be apart from society at some point in their lives, whereas the diurnal domiciles of the malefics, like Aries and Aquarius, it's more like a choice they're a bit happier to go
they're
their own
enacting rejection versus receiving rejection.
Yeah, Aries is like, I'm not going to just sit around here and do nothing. Like, there's so much I want to do. And Aquarius is like, I'm not going to sit around here and just do what everybody else is doing because they're all idiots.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And then we connect it with the, diurnal versus nocturnal thing, and the idea of the sun emitting things versus emitting light versus the moon receiving light in terms of that alternation of the signs.
Yeah, the expressive fire and air signs versus the receptive or responsive earth and water signs.
Yeah,
I think it really helps understand like the differing motivations perhaps of Saturn as Capricorn versus Saturn as Aquarius, and why perhaps Saturn has more dignity by triplicity in air signs, as being able to be proactive with its ideas, rather than having to defend them, I guess, so much.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, as a contrast, that Capricorn, although ruled by Saturn and a nocturnal sign, has that earthy component that is a little bit more organic in some ways. And when you get to Aquarius, that's one of the ways that I think, with it being a Saturn-ruled air sign and a fixed sign, that we get the associations with technology. But then sometimes you get this feeling like sometimes it's that technology can be cold and like not organic in some ways. And I think that becomes a contrast between Capricorn and Aquarius as well, as there's a little bit more coldness to Aquarius than there is in Capricorn, even though Capricorn can have that reputation for being cold or pessimistic or distant. There's still a little bit more of a warmth there than you might expect.
I was going to say Aquarius might be like totally content with the idea of like living in virtual reality for the rest of its life, or becoming a part human cyborg, like distancing from the body because it's all up in the head, the air sign. Whereas Capricorn is just going to be, so as an earth sign, so much more aware of like, yeah, you could escape to virtual reality, but down here on Earth, things are still, we're still running out of resources. We're still, on the verge of extinction, etc. It's like Capricorn can't escape the physical like Aquarius can.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so let's transition into comparing the other signs. And part of how we do this is by first looking at the modalities. And I know we've done a little bit of that already, but if we compare Capricorn to the other 4 cardinal signs, that might be a partial starting point here. So Capricorn is one of the cardinal signs. The other 3 are Aries, Cancer, and Libra. So we've already talked a bit about the comparison with Cancer as the sign opposite in the moon. Why don't we talk a little bit about Aries and the ways in which Capricorn and Aries have tensions through the square, as well as some of the ways that they're similar as a result of both being cardinal signs?
I was just going to say, one of the first things that comes up is like Aries is so much more immediate than Capricorn, right? Aries is very much of the present moment, whereas Capricorn is definitely thinking both backwards in terms of tradition and forwards in terms of like building something that endures. Aries is like, I'm just going to do it, right? Like consequence is not as heavy for Aries, but consequence is absolutely heavy for Capricorn.
Yeah, when Aries runs into a wall doing whatever it's doing, it just goes, oh, that hurt, whatever. Whereas Capricorn goes, oh, I ran into a wall. I really should have prepared better so that I would have been able to.
Why didn't I bring my climbing gear to ascend this wall?
Like, and you might just sit there and be like, all right, next time I'm going to be able to get over that wall. Meanwhile, Aries has already run its head into 17 other walls and also not cared.
Yeah.
Yeah, that impulsiveness is something that's definitely more dominant in Aries, and I think could be a little bit annoying for Capricorn, not thinking through things ahead of time or not making some sort of plan ahead of time, whereas Aries just wants to dive in sort of like head first immediately, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. There's also a tension, a fundamental tension there, because one of the things we talked about in the Aries episode that I thought was really great as a keyword for Aries is speed and quickness, and like the need for speed, and that manifesting in different ways, including sometimes just very simple things like driving fast, wanting to get somewhere quickly, versus with Capricorn, sometimes wanting to be a little bit more cautious and do things slowly, even though it's still a cardinal sign, you're still initiating action. There's a fundamental difference there in terms of it being a Saturn ruled sign that moves a little bit more slowly.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Like, I think of whenever you describe on the podcast Mars and Saturn coming into alignment, there's that, the stop and go, the putting down the gas pedal at the same time as the brake pedal, that when Aries and Capricorn are both enacted, it feels very much like that. Like, trying to go fast at the same time as taking your time.
But that also, it's like whenever that square is more productive rather than obstructive, I guess, that's like the judicious use of the brakes whenever you're hitting a corner, right? It's accelerating at the right time and braking at the right time to efficiently get around the track.
Yeah, absolutely. So one is actually able to perhaps reach Capricorn's goals more quickly if correctly applying some Aries speed, but balancing it with the Capricorn brakes.
Right. It's like reaching not your most maximum speed, but your maximum sustainable speed given the terrain.
I love that. That's great. That's a great extension of that analogy that we've always used of like hitting the brakes and the gas at the same time, which we've always used for like Mars Saturn combinations, especially conjunctions, as a metaphor for frustration and inability and inaction. But actually there is a productive use of that when you're like if you're like playing Mario Kart and you do like a power slide around like a turn or hit the e-brake on something, it's like you're drifting at that point.
Yeah.
And your drifting is like finding that perfect balance between momentum and stop and go in order to like take a sharp turn as quickly as you can.
Yeah, exactly. It takes a lot of skill. You have to know what you're doing. But you also have to, it takes practice, and it also takes gas, right? You have to have the mastery and the fuel together.
Right.
Yeah, I love the power slide metaphor. I'm going to, with my own Aries sun, I'm going to take that to how do we just drift into these things? But it's a great point because Aries, would prefer as the crow flies, like the most direct route possible to get to where it's going. But that's not always the actual most efficient route, because there might be a quicksand pit, in that direct route. So with some proper planning, you could find what's truly the most efficient route by considering all of the possible things the obstacles that could be there along the way.
For sure. All right. I think that's pretty good for those two. Why don't we transition into talking about the other cardinal sign that we've only touched on briefly at this point, which is Libra, which is ruled by Venus, cardinal, air, diurnal, or a masculine sign, compared to Capricorn. So in the notes, Camille said that Libra initiates partnership and collaboration, and that's part of the comparison with Capricorn initiating strategy and long-term goals.
You can see how that could be both beneficial for Capricorn in terms of like, could be easier to meet your goals if you collaborate or you partner someone with someone, but also potentially frustrating for that same reason. You have to take that time to really consider the other person's opinion, and it might not be as efficient as just doing everything yourself.
Yeah, Capricorn like knows the best way to do it and wants to do it its way because it knows what it thinks is the best way to do it, rather than having to share that with somebody else and like have somebody else that may not be able to be as effective as they are.
Yeah, I think about Libra as also very interconnective, which definitely finds friction with like the Saturnian isolation like often
Mhm.
preference, right? It's not just, I don't care about other people's feelings. It's like, it's more comfortable for me to just do it myself.
Mhm.
And so to be brought into an interconnective way of addressing things can be quite challenging.
Mhm. You
Mhm.
can see the benefit too, whereas if Capricorn does learn to work with Libra, the results that it's trying to produce are more pleasant, are more charming, are more
Right.
aesthetic.
There's more artfulness that Libra brings in.
Mhm.
And even just thinking about Saturn's exaltation in Libra, where, I feel like Saturnian or like Capricornian dedication and hard work actually encourages Libra to reach levels of like artistry that it maybe would not achieve otherwise, right? So it's like
Totally.
the Capricorn part is like, no, we have to put in the work on the ground. We have to put in our reps essentially. And Libra sees the benefit by, increased graciousness or whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, like any fine artist will tell you, like it's not that they were just born naturally with this talent. That might be an aspect of it, but it's years of dedicated study, really focusing in on, for instance, like that piece of art that you have from Alex Mon behind you. It's like, I know that they're meticulously studying the physical form in order to understand how to properly represent it in 2 dimensions. And that takes years and years of practice and effort.
Plus then their study of astrology in order to like translate astrological concepts through artistic representation. And this is also just making me think about like Libra's like social component, of just like trying to make sure that this like initiating connections. There's something about the like making sure that the connections are durable that Capricorn brings in. It's just like, are you introducing people because like they're going to think that each other is cute, but there's really not any substance between them? Or are you introducing people who will be able to have mutually reciprocal relationship for the long term?
Right. Like Capricorn doesn't want to do just that superficial Libra thing of just, let's all just pretend to be nice because isn't nice?
Because
nice?
it's pleasant, I guess.
Isn't it just nice to be nice?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, is nice actually accomplishing something? If not, then, count me out.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I think Libra, in that relationship to Capricorn is able to be like, hey, you don't want to be like Aries over there and just be like a self-centered asshole.
Right. Yeah, there's something about like, what is the strategic utility of kindness?
Exactly.
Right? Like kindness in and of itself is great. And also it has positive long-term consequences.
You're going to reach, so many more people with this like legacy or this goal that you're trying to build if you incorporate social awareness.
Yep.
Yeah. It also, that contrast between Capricorn and Libra, it makes me think I saw this post recently on Reddit where it was talking about, it's trying to like explain probably to millennials how marriage is not just like a piece of paper. And it was explaining that in the context of somebody who they'd been in a relationship for like many years, for like 10 or 15 years. And I'm guessing they were in like their 30s or something, and they just never got married because they didn't think it was important, and they lived together and everything else. But then their partner got sick and entered like end of the life stuff. So they ended up getting married, and they were explaining like the legal benefits of that, of marriage, and like, and that, marriage comes with a lot of immediate legal benefits, and how that's one of the few things that like immediately makes two people who are otherwise not related family members and creates like a legally binding document. So then when the person died, their family, who the person didn't have much connection with, came out of nowhere and tried to like take all of the possessions and stuff of the deceased partner, even though that wasn't their wishes, and tried to like, while the partner was in hospice, like move them to like another state so they could like die where they grew up, except the partner didn't want that at all. Neither of the two individuals wanted that at all. So it really explained that marriage in that context and creating that legally binding structure of like merging your two personalities in some ways, or lives, in a way that created a single entity between the two of you actually had real practical like value and justification beyond just like a romantic or ideal sort of like a justification.
Right. Marriage isn't just the fairy tale wedding. Like marriage has very concrete and tangible consequences, some of which are very desirable, some of which, you know, may or may not be desirable depending on your situation.
Right.
True. Yeah, the commitment that it involves or the legally binding nature, like it gives the benefits, but then also creates the restrictions that are harder to, you know, it's much more, if you're just going from the strict, like getting the legal papers done side of things, it can actually be much less expensive to get married than it can be to get divorced in terms of who you're paying.
Way less expensive, actually.
Yeah.
Even just like with the court fees and things like that.
Just
like
the court fees.
Like less than $50 to get married and probably $500 plus to get divorced. And that's not if you're hiring a lawyer or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
There's also the reality that for some people, like marriage can actually create worse problems. Right. So like in the United States, if you are somebody who is disabled and on disability, if you marry and your spouse's resources increase your tax, you know, net taxes, net income or whatever, a certain level, you lose your benefits.
Yeah, that
it's really interesting.
Capricorn's fear of perhaps partnership in that way, just like being aware that there are consequences to choosing to go in it with
really
someone else.
Yeah. And don't you take on also like the debt? You can take on like the debt of your partner as well.
If there isn't a sufficient prenuptial agreement, you can end up being responsible for hundreds, if not more, like thousands and thousands of dollars of another person's debt.
That's a great keyword for like Saturn Libra combinations, or for Capricorn Libra combinations, is prenuptial agreement.
Yes, absolutely. Actually,
yes. Let's plan for the worst in case this doesn't work out.
Yeah. I love you. And also, I don't know who I'm going to be in 10 years.
Yeah. Let's just thinking realistically. Things might not work out.
Yeah. What's the disaster plan?
Just disaster plan in general. Capricorn. Capricorn keywords.
It reminds me of like Steven Spielberg's chart where he has Cancer rising and he has Mars and Capricorn in the 7th house, and Saturn is ruling the 7th house, and it's in the 2nd house of personal finances. And he got married in like the 1980s, and they had a like prenuptial agreement, but they wrote it on like a napkin for some reason. And when they got divorced, he took the napkin to the judge, and the judge was just like, what the hell is this? And
doesn't count.
Yeah, predictably voided the napkin prenup, and then they were married in California. So then his spouse got half of what he was worth. And at the time, in the late 80s and early 90s, it was the most costly celebrity divorce in history.
Wow.
It sounds very Aries. Be like, oh, it's just write it here on a napkin. That'll do, right? Let's go.
Yeah, well, here's a chart. So maybe I never brought this component into play. I always looked at this as a ruler of the 7th in the 2nd house night chart Saturn example, because the reason I even found this example is like somebody challenged me on this once with his chart with the doctrine of sect, where they said, you know, this is this famous director. He's one of the most famous movie directors of all time. He's very wealthy, but he has Saturn in the 2nd house in a night chart. So how could that possibly make sense? Because we would think that the doctrine of sect then should say that he shouldn't have money or something like that. And I was like, well, no, that's not necessarily what it means. Let's look at what happened when that Saturn placement was active. And did he ever suffer any, what he perceived as experiences of like financial loss? And sure enough, like I believe it was like a 7th house Capricorn perfection year, that was when that divorce took place. But it's also interesting. I just noticed that
the square was Neptune.
Exactly. Like Neptune at 10 degrees of Libra squaring the ascendant, but also the descendant at 10 degrees of Capricorn. And that sort of ambiguity there, therefore intention between those signs.
Wow.
Yeah. So
there's something there too that's, I think, helpful for beginning astrologers to learn or to remember, that like a placement of a malefic in a house or in a sign doesn't necessarily mean that your entire life is a struggle or there's no room for accomplishment or achievement in that area of life. Like sometimes it is just a singular, very momentous or notable instance of struggle or challenge that ends up telling that story or fulfilling that promise.
Yeah.
Yeah. exactly. It can be like a one-time thing, or it can be a thing that happens, for example, with James Earl Jones, where he had, those problems speaking early on, but then eventually was able to overcome that, and things largely become better and everything else.
Yeah, it's almost like, again, with the larger term perspective of time, if you were able to look at your life as a whole, once your life has closed its book, then you will see how perhaps all of the natal placements at a certain point told their story.
Yeah, I was trying to explain that to somebody the other day of why it's hard to do consultations for younger people, because sometimes you'll say something, but it may not be something they've experienced yet. So it may not land or may not hit because it's describing a sometimes singular or maybe even an event that happens a couple of times that still lies in the future.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. I think is another one of the reasons why I'd say like Capricorn, in terms of getting lighter with age, it's almost like the relief of like, I've like, now I know what my challenges were or have been. Like nothing can surprise me now.
Evidence of survival goes a long way in reducing anxiety. Just being like, oh yeah, I got through that. I'm still alive. Got through that. It did not kill me. That one actually made me better. Right?
Yeah.
And to be able to then look back on that and say, if not thank you, at least that wasn't terrible. Or it wasn't the absolute most worst thing that ever could have ever happened ever. And then it's like, okay, so these other things that are coming up, I don't have to be quite as clenched around. Because I have proven to myself, or life has proven to me, that even though I feel like I'm in the meat grinder, I'm not sausage yet. Yeah,
absolutely.
Is clenched a Capricorn keyword? Is that one?
I would say so. It's like that tightness, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right.
There's the tension. I mean, as a former body worker, I was a clinical massage therapist who focused mainly on fascia, which is connective tissue, which I think is extremely Saturnian. And like the tension in the body, the like holding it together, that sort of sensation of responsibility that creates rigidity, that clenchy, definitely. Like you don't, I think about like Caitlin Kopic's like wears, like you don't want a Saturn body butter. Like that's not going to melt anything.
Right.
Yeah. Even the embodiment, I think, like when you describe people who are Saturn natives, how there's just like maybe a tendency towards like the hunched shoulders and like more like this, the lean physique, just because of the like psychically carrying all of that weight. Or
it can also be like really great bones, right? Like healthy Saturn is like healthy teeth and like good bone density. And like with especially Capricorn, it's like the structures being in good shape. But if that Saturn is not so great, that can look like osteoporosis and osteoarthritis.
Right.
Like cavities, root canals.
Makes me think of a famous Capricorn moon with Cancer rising, who's Arnold Schwarzenegger. And just his whole bodybuilding career, and just like working so much to be in like peak physical condition and peak physical like physique.
Wow. And that's another Saturn in the second example. And this understanding of like the body as a primary resource. And so needing to build the body over time as that primary resource.
Yeah, a good way to show, again, like how the detriment of the moon doesn't mean that the body is going to just like suck, whatever. Like it just means that the moon is now working really, really hard, like, incorporating those Capricorn components instead of, in Cancer, the moon might like to just lay around on pillows and,
Right.
Yeah,
for sure. And what you were saying earlier, Diana, about the perils, or not the perils, the advantages of, being older and looking back and seeing the challenging events and having greater understanding and context and being okay with them. The reverse is also true. And I actually came across a tweet that was very perfect today for Capricorn season along those lines that said, it was like a quote. It said, knowing too much can make one old too soon. All knowledge comes at the right time, And this is from Shreem Astrology on Twitter, who's a Vedic astrologer. So shout out to that. But I thought that was really interesting thinking about that, because it's kind of true, especially, and it's something we can become familiar with as astrologers. Knowing one of the downsides I always say of trying to find out the future with astrology is like knowing the future, because sometimes that information can be kind of heavy. And that also makes me think of that phenomenon we were talking about earlier of people who were young that had to become old before their time or had to grow up soon because they had, the older responsibilities earlier on, or even having knowledge before one normally does is a sort of weight on one's shoulders that can weigh on you and age you much quicker.
Right. There's something about how innocence is the absence of knowing. And
ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss. It's like, whenever you gain experience and you're no longer innocent, you can't go back. Like, you can't unlearn things. Like, you can relearn things. You can learn things differently, but you can't actually remove awareness from your system.
Yeah, you can't forget that like Santa's not real, for example.
Right. Yeah, you can't forget Santa's not real. You can't. You're never gonna.
I'm sorry if I'm breaking that to anybody that's listening. Oh
no! Well, I mean, I think that's
a disclaimer on the Capricorn episode.
I feel like Santa's real, but not in the storybook way.
Okay, you're
the
right.
Spirit of Santa.
No, I completely take that back, because people do listen to this with their children. Santa is real, and I don't know why I just said that just now.
Well, because it was a joke. It's a thing that a lot of adults
joke.
Say. Crack jokes about childhood.
That's true.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say, so I'm going to be done.
The whole knowledge makes you old before your time is another thing that I consider about the the millennial generation or whatever, with the Uranus and Neptune in the Saturn ruled signs. The experience of being the first generations to have access to the internet at home as children. And so, I've certainly know that in my personal experience that changed me. That gave me the ability at a very young age to know that the world was not what it seemed, to know that there were things going on that were, that were heavy, or that were, just the ability to expose oneself to all of the information on the planet from a young age it will change, it's a change on childhood. Yeah.
Especially to be youthful and learning very, very quickly, and basically to surpass your parents and navigating the internet prior to being a fully cooked adult.
Absolutely. And I feel like that enables us to, to do more, or to almost I don't want to say evolve, because I hate when people use that term without enough time span that would actually justify evolution. But you think of just how the youth might critique or want to be different than their parents. So people who have access to the internet from a young age just have the ability to hone in on what do I care about? What do I want to do? Who are the people who are also doing that? Just find the paths to their personal goals much more quickly or much more efficiently.
Yeah, I feel like there's something here about the cardinal tension with that can be articulated, where it's just here's this tangible thing that allows me to, tangible thing that I can do stuff with, Capricorn, that allows me to interconnect, Libra, with people who I might not otherwise interconnect with, and pursue ideas and things like that I might not get otherwise, which allows me to cultivate giving a shit in particular ways, Cancer, that might not be otherwise available, in a way that's all about my own personal pursuits, Aries. And then one of the things that happens there is where are the elders, right? The Capricorn component is hey, slow down, kid. You got to actually be in tune with reality. How many people have been radicalized, young people especially, young men especially, have been radicalized down truly terrible pathways because of unsupervised access to the internet that isn't grounded with actual tangible relationships in the real world.
Right. Like incels and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's true. Even just go ahead.
I was going to think of like people find like, authority figures, role models, or a Capricorn archetype. And so, kids find their role models or their authority figures on the internet who are just, social media influencers or famous podcast hosts.
Yeah. and their life may or may not be what their life is presented as well. Like you don't have that tangibility to confirm or deny veracity of presentation.
Mm-hmm. But they're more engaging than perhaps the authority figures or the role models that would otherwise be present in that person's community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think podcast hosts are a fine thing to pattern your life around and take parental advice from.
Sure.
But even just internet aside, there's lots of times when I think younger people sometimes find themselves in a situation if they grow up with difficulties in their household where they have to take on extra responsibilities before they're young, or like people that have to play the role of parent if, for example, there's a missing parent, or if there's a parent that has, drug or alcohol abuse issues and they have to like raise their siblings on their own or something like that. There's lots of like versions of that archetype of the person that has to become the authority figure or the parent before they otherwise normally would. And therefore that kind of like ages them up pretty quickly.
Yeah, totally. It's like most people who are precocious, most kids who are precocious didn't choose to be precocious.
Right. Yeah, it was just a survival tactic almost.
Mature for your age is less of a compliment than people think.
Exactly. Also, the advice, while we're at it with false compliments to Capricorn folks, the advice like, oh, why don't you just stop being so hard on yourself? Like...
Seems like you really have your shit together. I don't have anything to offer you.
Right.
Or
can you help me with this? Instead of being like, oh, it looks like you might need help.
I didn't realize that you were struggling. It just seemed like you were, you
do a really good job.
I am.
Yeah, you do a really good job at looking like you're doing okay.
Right, like high functionality despite whatever might be going on.
Yeah.
Just because I'm highly functional doesn't mean
I like it. Doesn't mean it's actually sustainable or good.
Hashtag burnout.
Yeah, like honestly, burnout I would say is burnout is like the most Capricornian. Like if I think about all of the signs and I think about all of the signs through the lens of burnout, I'm just like, there's nothing like Capricorn burnout. Yeah.
But it feels almost like that, again, the Benjamin Button thing, like after Capricorn's like great burnout, like hitting maybe their personal rock bottom, that might be when they're able to take themselves or take life a little bit less seriously.
Yeah, the shell is cracked and now it's just a mess.
All right, we're back from break. We have a perfect Capricornian issue, which is Diana's computer is down to 20%. So we now have a race against time, and we have a deadline to finish this episode, which means we have to do things as efficiently as possible. So we're going to grind through the other sign comparisons that we haven't done yet. First one, let's switch to the triplicities. Taurus, first Earth sign compared to Capricorn. Trines, so they get along. What do they share in common, or what are their affinities?
They share a slowness in common.
Substantiality. Tangibility.
Tangibility and materiality, I think, are things they share in common. A love for things that are nice things.
Perhaps a bit of inflexibility in terms of having their mind made up about what is nice or what is good.
Yeah, Taurus is interesting because it has very defined tastes. Like once it finds what it likes to do that thing like over and over again. And Capricorn has a similar thing in terms of maybe sometimes having more refined tastes or inflexibility in terms of its preferences, perhaps.
Yeah, I feel like with Capricorn, there's more of a cultivation of preference and cultivation of taste, like over time. Like the refining process is part of the pleasure.
Yeah,
and I say this as a Venus.
Saying no to things.
Right. And I say this as someone with Venus in Capricorn. So, whereas with Taurus, there is sort of this just like, no, I've identified what it is. And that's just what it is. Like, I'm not trying to work on it because it's fine. It's perfect the way that it is.
Right. And that may be something that's like extremely basic and like unrefined, but that Taurus just like likes because that's its personal taste.
Taurus is also very hardworking, which is something they share in common. Is Taurus like understands that in order to have the nice thing that it wants, it's like that takes time, but it's like the motivation towards pleasure and security, perhaps more so than the motivation of Capricorn, which is towards that legacy or that impact on the world.
There's something about once you get Taurus going, you're not going to make it stop. Like once Taurus is in motion, and what generates that motion is more about preferences versus impact. But like with Capricorn, the motivation and the process is the point sometimes, right? It's not about the achievement of the thing at the other end. It's about the thing itself.
Right. That makes sense. All right. I think that's good for Taurus and Capricorn. Let's move on to the last Earth sign to compare, which is Taurus and Virgo. What are the things we've talked about, or I talked about earlier, like a similar connection in terms of Virgo is able to focus on the small things and therefore is able to see when there's something small that's out of place. Virgo's very good about like sequential order and like the little things falling in order, like words and letters and sentences. So that it can be really good at like editing a written document, for example, whereas Capricorn is good at seeing the flaws in something and therefore has a sort of similarity in that way.
I would say like Capricorn is more like, how's your outline? Like, what's the overall structure and how do we need to improve the overall structure? Whereas Virgo is, what are the details inside the structure and how do we refine the details inside the structure?
Like the chapter structure versus like the actual sentences.
Right. Yeah.
Capricorn, keeping in mind like what, if we're going, like Virgo might be really talented at writing in a particular style or crafting the thing to be like shaping the thing to be what it needs to be, but Capricorn might set that direction, like set that like we're going to need this type of style because we're trying to do this type of thing.
Yeah, one thing, like this is actually something I help my friends with sometimes, is just like, well, what is the point? Like, what are you actually trying to achieve with whatever it is that you're making? Understanding that what you're trying to achieve will determine the best possible structure and delivery methodology.
And they're both able to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and then like Virgo is like, okay, but how do we refine that into the specifics of what's being presented? Yeah.
I was going to touch on that Virgo is also very capable of self-flagellation and self-restriction, like self-denial, as it seeks to perfect itself or to refine away the flaws in whatever it's working on, maybe not just the self. Virgo's very willing to do without anything that feels, extraneous or, less than ideal once it decides what it's trying to, manipulate or craft.
Yeah, and they're both signs that deal with specialization or mastery in that way, and maybe that's connected to the fact that they're both exaltation signs and both Earth signs, where Mercury is exalted in Virgo and Mars is exalted in Capricorn, and they're both Earth signs.
Yeah.
I just think of what do Mars and Mercury do together if they're on like a dream team. It's just like they very quickly and efficiently edit and refine and articulate. Exactly.
Yeah. Or
what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to say? Let's do it. Let's say it now.
Yeah, and that's what exaltation is all about, is raising something up or being up to the highest level of something. So doing something at the highest level is part of the concept of exaltation. I think that's something that Virgo and Capricorn definitely both share in common.
Yeah. Think of someone who's just like a chess champion. It's like a exalted Virgo, exalted Capricorn kind of thing.
Yeah. One example I was really annoyed I meant to mention, so I'm going to throw it in here in the series in the Virgo episode, and I forgot, was the birth chart of Donald Glover, who has Virgo rising with Mercury in Virgo, and he wears like so many different hats, and there's so many different fields that he's gotten into and then excelled in each of those different fields. And I've always been impressed as an actor, as like a musician, as a comedian. Like he does all these different things, which is a very Mercury type thing. Like Mercury likes to wear many different hats, but then also having it in the sign of its exaltation and like, sometimes rising to the top of different fields at different points.
Yeah, Virgo could encourage Capricorn in that way to pursue multiple skill sets, like maybe rather than honing in on just mastering one, it's being able to identify like, oh, I'm going to need to, if I want to make a movie, I'm going to need to be a director, be a cinematographer, be an editor. I always think of Bo Burnham. Is that like Mercury and Virgo example where in that, that recent Netflix movie he did, he's like, I wrote and directed and filmed and edited and starred in and even commented
all of
on all of it.
It's
while
interesting.
He was having his Saturn and Capricorn Saturn return.
That's hilarious. One thing that I think, it's like Virgo gives Capricorn the accessory work that will facilitate the big plan, the big project, right? So it's like, when I think in terms of like weightlifting or something, it's like, you could do squats and deadlifts all day, but if you never do accessory work, you might not break through your plateaus. Like the accessory work is actually very helpful for furthering the project. It's not a distraction.
That's such a good keyword. Plateaus in working out is a great Capricorn keyword because it's that thing where you go to a gym and you'll start lifting weights and you'll see a lot of progress like really fast. Like your muscles will start getting bigger.
Newbie gains.
Right. But then at a certain point, you'll see it slow down and all of a sudden you're doing the same weights, but you're not like gaining muscle mass as much and it plateaus. So then eventually what you end up having to do is find a different way to do it and like push it in order to jump up to the next level. And there's something about that initial push or the initial leap, sort of like a goat, like jumping up to like the next level on like a mountain that is really core to Capricorn in that archetype from the cardinalness of the energy.
Right. And there's also what's interesting is that depending on why you're plateauing, oftentimes the answers are eating more, sleeping more, or resting more, right? You might need to deload processes of just like you cut how much you're lifting in half for a couple of weeks, and then you actually come back stronger. Recuperation is what facilitates continued progress. That Cancer Capricorn axis. And that's also Taurus, right? Taurus is like slow down.
It feels very Taurus.
Eat enough, and then you'll actually be able to progress.
Got it. Okay. Cool. I think that's good for Capricorn and Virgo. I mean, we could stay there for a while, but I think we can keep moving for the sake of efficiency and time. Capricorn, so what's left now is sometimes we do the sextile signs, which are the other complementary signs. One of them is Capricorn and Scorpio and what they share in common versus Capricorn and Pisces. Capricorn and Scorpio is a little bit easier because I think they share sort of a little bit of a strategic outlook of like planning ahead or sometimes being able to see the weaknesses or the shortcomings in something. For Capricorn, it's like in a critical sense of like seeing the cracks and the systemic problems in something, whereas for Scorpio, it's almost like seeing the weakness in somebody's armor and therefore knowing like where to shoot like an arrow in order to like hit that weakness. And I think those are similar energies between those two.
Efficiency and conservancy is part of that, I would say, where it's, Capricorn wants to fix things so that they're least energetically like expensive as possible, to like refine the budget so we're not wasting money or time. And with Scorpio, it's like, I don't want to render myself more vulnerable than I need to be. So I'm going to be very specific and precise with how I'm doing whatever it is in order to be efficient in my emotional expenditures.
They also share that just the awareness of, the dark side of life, of not being able to turn away from, acknowledging that, things are heavy. Life is not all, flowers and sunshine. I think they, that sextile really like speaks, I think perhaps because of the Capricorn rising chart with Scorpio as the 11th sign, so ruling the place of friendship. You find that Scorpios and Capricorns are, birds of a feather in that way, just like they can be together, just being super sarcastic or trying to find like levity, despite maybe the hardships that they've endured.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that those are the two nocturnal malefic ruled signs, basically, because the other two malefic ruled signs are both diurnal signs, are Aries and Aquarius.
Yeah, I think Capricorn and Scorpio appreciate that about one another, that they're like, there's no bullshit between them. Like, just tell it like it is. Tell me how you really feel about me. Tell me, what's really going on for you, that kind of thing.
Sometimes there's a bluntness to that and a willingness to just like look at the negative side of things or the stark side, or sometimes even the gloomy, or what some people might consider like the morbid side of things.
Yeah. And there's like an appreciation of the meaning-making qualities of death, which honestly I think also extends towards Pisces. Too, like if we were to bridge into the sextile between Capricorn and Pisces, just thinking about how much, the oceanic quality of Pisces. It's not just the cute spirit experience, just like zoning out. It's also getting completely subsumed by emotion, like grief. And I think that making meaning from those sorts of overwhelming experiences, that's something that both Pisces and Capricorn can effectively do.
And Pisces can give Capricorn that like levity, that Jupiterian perspective of, because Pisces is also aware of, all of the nuances of suffering and pain in the world. But the Jupiterian outlook is just like, and isn't that great?
Right.
Everything exists in the universe and it's amazing.
Right. And Capricorn can ground whenever Pisces does feel very like completely drowned by experience, like can't find the Jupiterian levity, but just is in the oceanic experience.
Yeah.
Capricorn's like, even the ocean has a floor.
Or even that, like, I'll be your rock in the, in the storm.
Yeah.
That makes me think of both Capricorn and Pisces and a tendency to need to look to something bigger. And for Capricorn, you're looking to something like an authority figure sometimes, or looking for an authority figure like somebody you can follow or pattern yourself after, or something that you look up to, versus like in Pisces, wanting to look to something bigger in terms of meaning or like spiritual truth or something like that.
Yeah. And, I would say like Capricorn doesn't necessarily need a person, but like a purpose.
Right. That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas like Pisces doesn't necessarily need a purpose, but meaning. Like, and like fine tooth combing those differences is kind of hard, but meaning isn't so directed.
That one's tricky because I think Pisces, even though it's a sextile, would have some tendency to be a little annoying to Capricorn because of the lack of direction.
Unseriousness.
Right.
And Scorpio would be annoying to Capricorn from the perspective of like, why aren't you doing anything? Like you're just sitting, you're sitting,
wallowing in it.
You're literally just rolling around in the swamp. Come on, let's go.
Yeah, to both Pisces and Scorpio, Capricorn is just like, all right, like, are we done crying now? Like you take all the time you need, but eventually, like, especially to Pisces, Capricorn is like, we do have physical bodies. I'm sorry, I have to remind you, but you're in a life, like you're in a physical form. We're gonna have to take care of some necessities.
You can't transcend just because you're heartbroken. I'm sorry.
Not yet. Like we will die. Yeah. It's fine. We will die one day, but for now, let's keep living. Let's keep doing the thing.
Yeah. And there's definitely some escapist tendencies with Pisces, which I think Capricorn, being more grounded, would have more problems with. Yeah. And
Yeah,
sometimes
Capricorn can never fully let go of reality in that way that Pisces can. Like, cannot permit itself to be totally
Mm-hmm.
escaped.
it's too risky to do that.
Mhm.
Because there's also like a timeless quality to Pisces. Like time is like boundless, or to escape to like an imaginal realm with Pisces versus, with Capricorn, the closest you get to that would be like the world builder, would be like the one that's like building an imaginary world or something like that. Like Tolkien, or like George R.R. Martin or somebody like that.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's interesting that Capricorn has that relationship with Pisces where it has the aversion with Sagittarius. So it's almost like it likes Pisces, dreams and ideals more than it likes Sagittarius's. Perhaps because Pisces is more concerned with other people, or with like a bigger perspective. And Sagittarius might, as a fire sign, be a little bit more self-focused. Yeah. Something I just think about is like, why does Capricorn get along with one Jupiter sign but not acknowledge that the other one exists?
I mean, they're also just sitting together. Sagittarius and Capricorn, they're sitting right next to each other. But like, yeah.
But just kind of thinking of the notion of aversion as just like, yeah, they're sitting right next to you, but you're just like, yeah.
You're thinking about something else. Yeah, you're talking to someone else.
Yeah.
So speaking of aversion, that takes us to our last two signs, I believe, which are Gemini and Leo, and how they relate or do not relate to Capricorn, since they share none of the same qualities in common. So why don't we start with Gemini, if we can? What do you think?
I mean, whenever I think about Gemini, I think about butterflies, and I cannot think of a less Saturnian creature.
Right.
Right. Or like even like mayflies, right? Like these like little winged beings whose life is like 24 hours. Like they're barely here. Like they're here, they reproduce, and then they're done. They're gone. That's it.
I'm hearing I've never heard anybody like critique butterflies in their existence before until
I love them. They're so necessary. They're so pretty. They're so flitty, and they disappear like instantly. They're like barely around.
That's so funny. You're like, what a useless bug. Butterflies. They
pollinate. They pollinate. They do have a purpose.
They do.
They do have a purpose.
I feel like you're backtracking.
Very efficient. Yeah, they get the job done.
I get. Yeah, they're so efficient. Well, but, it's like they do not endure, right? They do not endure, and they like their lives are spent mostly literally in the air, like not grounded. So just from that perspective, it's just like the antithesis of Saturnianness, like ephemeral and ungrounded.
Like mutable, air, diurnal. Obviously like just having nothing in common with the Cardinal, Earth.
One of my favorite perfumes is called the Butterfly, for the record. So no shade on butterflies.
No shade. I just want to quickly clarify too. No shade on Sagittarius. I'm sorry I keep like harping on how much Capricorn hates Sagittarius.
I mean, as a Sagittarius person, I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like we're friends.
No, we're totally friends. Yeah. It's just, it feels like Sagittarius just has it so easy sometimes.
Too easy. It's true. It's true.
So back to Gemini. So there can be sometimes a surface level or almost shallow quality to Gemini, whereas I think that would be a tension with Capricorn that wants to be more serious, wants to dwell in more serious long-term matters, whereas Gemini, like Aries, is more like quick and short.
Yeah, there's also something with the way that Gemini can like collect and disperse information, but sometimes without that much discernment. Which I think it can be troubling to the like, what is the substantial thing to say and share that Saturn has? I even think like right now I'm even imagining like the Ents in the Lord of the Rings.
The tree people.
The tree, like tree beard. Yeah, like these like living trees. They're very old. Their speech is so slow that takes them forever to make a decision. And then you have these little hobbits, there's two hobbits, they're Gemini, coming in, being like spicy and fast.
and they're all like talkative, and they're talking very quickly, and the Ents are like talking very slowly and very deliberately.
Right. And the hobbits want a quick decision. It's just like, we need to go get Saruman right now. And the Ents are like, now is a very fast time.
Yeah, they have to go and have like a meeting and everything else.
And it takes them all night just to say hello.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that.
It's very
All
much
right.
the Capricorn being like, wait, what are you actually trying to say, Gemini?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you've just said like 1,000 words, but what were you trying to convey?
What was the meaning in that? Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's going to be our animal. We need to replace that goatfish. And for now on, like Capricorn is going to be the Ents or like the tree people from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I second this vote. Yeah.
Yeah, very relatable.
Okay. So, that tension can also be good. And that's sometimes why aversions are good, because it can, even though that they don't naturally relate or have that affinity, they can sometimes like drag each other into directions that can be useful. So that's
disrupting status quo.
And like diversifying maybe if the source material that Capricorn was drawing on for making its decisions. Gemini might be like, wait, but have you considered that your perspective that the world is fucked and whatnot? It might not actually be true according to
the world is fucked, and also have you listened to like the latest Lana Del Rey album? Like, come on.
Exactly. The levity is helpful.
Yeah, and just the flexibility. I think Gemini can help bring flexibility to Capricorn a little bit more than it would be otherwise, or to lighten up, which is also a quality Sagittarius helps Capricorn out with in terms of lightening up.
Yeah, I'm even thinking now of like the studies that have been done about like elder people. Like old people have better quality of life and improved cognitive capacities whenever they are regularly spending time with children. And children are also benefited by spending time with old people, like solidly old, totally retired, not necessarily mobile, limber people. Like there's a mutual benefit there, even though logically you're just like, but like, why would there be a kindergarten inside the old folks' home? Like that's actually good for everybody.
There's a great show about that, actually.
Yeah.
That's probably the best analogy, and is up there with the tree analogy in terms of the contrast between Gemini and Capricorn, as well as how those contrasts and those tensions or differences can sometimes be productive.
Yeah.
Every Capricorn needs a Gemini around to keep them young.
Yes.
Right.
But also just that, I guess really quickly, that phrase, jack of all trades, master of none, how often that's applied to Gemini and how maddening that is to Capricorn.
Capricorn's like, no, master of one.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you have like Gemini placements and Capricorn placements, how difficult that can be to reconcile, to be like, every new interest that I take on, I need to master it. Just like what an impossible task that can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I know.
Staring at Mars in my 6th house right now.
Oh, I know. Yeah. It's like the lesson for all Capricorn risings right now is like, have you tried doing less?
Yeah. All right, let's move on to our final contrast, I believe, unless I like totally skipped a sign, which is Leo versus Capricorn. I know we touched on that.
Last but not least.
Right.
Leo.
Saving the best for last, Leo.
There you go. That's why we were doing it.
Yeah.
Definitely not least. So Capricorn's a cardinal earth feminine sign, and Leo is a masculine fixed fire sign.
So one of the things that immediately comes up for me when I think about Capricorn and Leo is how both Capricorn and Leo have a similar but different singularity of focus. Like there's like with both of them, there's a like, I am going to be sovereign in some significant way for myself. And with Capricorn, it's like, I would like to be sovereign in order to accomplish in legacy and blah, 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 blah. Whereas I think with Leo, there's like, no, like solidity of self for its own sake, right? There isn't necessarily a purpose beyond that experience of solidity of aliveness, you know? And I think that can be a little confusing for Capricorn, where it's just like, what do you mean you're just being yourself?
Yeah.
For
Leo's
why?
Like, I just got to get my story out there. I just got to tell my story.
Leo's like, why are you working so hard? Why don't you just be yourself? Says Leo to Capricorn.
Yeah. Capricorn's like, because myself is not good enough.
Yeah. It's like, because myself is kind of boring, and it's actually the evidence of my selfhood that matters, aka my legacy and work.
Yeah. Like we can tell my story after I've
The
accomplished
biographer-
something noteworthy.
The biographer can take care of the story part. Like once I'm dead.
Exactly.
That's a really good though analogy or metaphor combination is just like the biography or the autobiography of a person who's lived a long and successful life doing many different interesting career things, and they built themselves up until they were somebody, or they made themselves into a celebrity where they're sort of like the center of a little solar system in their own life.
Yeah. I think that's where, if Capricorn and Leo are successfully, I won't say blended, but like merged in some way. Like that's it. It's the like I'm 80 years old and I'm having a ghostwriter do my autobiography while I sit and talk with them and eat cookies.
Yeah, that
very much. Go ahead.
Just to talk about oneself is the Leo part, but to talk about one's accomplishments is the Capricorn part.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Leo Capricorn integration as well could be kind of recognizing that one has to become the role model that they want to see in the world. Because with a Leo placement, people will be naturally like maybe noticing you or looking up to you, or or you'll feel that call to like put yourself out there. But then with Capricorn needing it to be a substantial reason that people are looking at you, it's like, well, if people are looking at me, I better like make sure that I'm like someone who's worth looking at.
Right. And that worth is actually interesting since Leo is the 8th sign from Capricorn. So from Capricorn's perspective, Leo being the 8th house, it's like, how am I sharing these resources with others? And, that sort of interesting relationship between owing other people things and like being oneself. So there's almost like a, I don't know, like I think about this tension quite a bit, in terms of like the real thing that you're sharing is the work that comes through you specifically. It's not just the work as a standalone. And so sometimes bridging that gap is that recognition of like, I might not be like special, but I'm also like, there's no one else that's like me.
Right. The unique combination of like your story or your life history, your skills, your ideas of what needs to happen.
Your mastery too. Like that's what you're giving the world, is that whole combination of things, not just, like if you're a cabinet maker or something, you're not just giving people useful cabinets, you're giving people the cabinets that only you can make.
That makes me think of Leo Capricorn combination makes me think of the role of like a movie director on a film set, and how it's like this singular person who's at the heart of everything and is sort of the center of that solar system that you have all these other people doing their jobs like sort of revolving around, but also who's playing this role of like the person with the plan, the person that is the authority figure, that the buck stops here, and that they say what goes, and they are the one that everybody looks to for guidance and direction on how we're going to get through this and how we're going to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Yeah, that's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
and like,
perfect.
unless you're Bo Burnham or whatever, you're also not on screen in the end, right? The movie, like most directors aren't in their movies.
Yeah,
but they're also all over their movies, right? It's like, when you're watching a David Lynch film. Right.
Yeah. And
just had to point out Bo Burnham is a Leo sun.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So there's a Leo sun with like 3 planets in Capricorn.
Yeah, the generational Capricorn stellium, but then Mercury and Virgo. So just like a really good example of what happens when Sun is in Leo and Mercury is in Virgo.
Yeah.
And along with the Capricorn stuff. It's just like, I will do everything. I will be at the center of attention, but it will nearly destroy me making it happen.
Right. And he was a funny example also of somebody that did that and rose to success very early through his talents. Like when he was like just a teenager. And I just remember him sitting in like a panel of comedians several years ago, and they're all like older comedians in their like 50s and 60s and 70s and stuff, and the contrast between them was just really interesting seeing. And it's a funny image.
And then that that awareness of, I guess, of the self, the flaws or the critiques of the self, reflecting on how to improve the self. That seems to be a lot of what the content of that movie Inside is about. It's like he's going through a Saturn return and he's realizing how his the cheap shots that he would take at maybe people who are from less advantaged social groups. He's like, I'm recognizing now that that was inappropriate and that it's my responsibility as like a straight white man to be as good of a person as I can.
Yeah. That was one of the best Saturn and Capricorn Saturn return stories. It was interesting. I'm going to have to do a Saturn returns in Aquarius one here pretty soon now that we're getting to the end of that. But speaking of getting to the end of things, I think we have gotten to the end of this episode and to our comparison with the different signs of the zodiac, unless there's any I've forgotten, but it looks like we did pretty well. This has been an amazing conversation. I really liked it. I'm sad it's over because funny is a very Saturn Capricorn thing where once we got warmed up and got going, I feel like we started covering like a lot of really amazing stuff and really got into it. And we could go forever, but the limits of time and space and other Saturn things are going to force us to come to a conclusion here. So tell me what each of you have going on and where can people find out more information about you? What do you have going on, Diana?
I'm currently working on some things that I can't talk about quite yet, but I also have a lot of previous things that I've done, like lectures and workshops that are available on my website. Continuing to do stuff on my Patreon. And every now and then I say interesting things on Instagram. So that's kind of it for now.
Nice. What's your website URL?
DianaRoseHarper.com, which will immediately convert to Damashana.com, but it's easier to spell Diana Rose Harper.
Nice. Okay. And what do you have going on, Madeline?
Mostly working behind the scenes on Honeycomb Collective, my business. It's a two-person business.
I actually forgot to introduce you at the very beginning of the episode, so that actually would be worth doing. So you're actually one of the two heads and the founder of the Honeycomb Collective and the Personal Astrological Almanacs, which we're huge fans of here on the show. And
best things in the world. Buy one now.
That's your brain. That's your brainchild, right?
Yeah, exactly. My partner Colin and I just
are geniuses.
I mean, he's the Aquarius stellium, so we'll give him the genius credit. Yeah. But no, so it's something because it's funny. Sometimes people think that we're like a big company, maybe because of just the proliferation of the product within the astrological community or the polished presentation of it. But yeah, it's the two of us. So if you ever write to our customer support, it's one of us that's going to answer it. If you if something happens to your product, it's one of us who's going to deal with it. Whenever people are like requesting new features and whatnot, I'm like, we will try to get to that.
Nice. So you sell personalized astrological almanacs based on a person's actual birth chart where people enter in their birth data and then it actually prints up like a custom personalized almanac that lists your transits for the year and things like that, right?
Exactly. So essentially we've created software that will automatically generate a personalized book, which we then will, manually review or refine when necessary. But it's like we're kind of a technology company, but this is very like with our Aquarius Capricorn synastry, just like bringing technology into the physical form, sort of the vibe. But yeah, so you can find more about that at honeycomb.co, which is honeycomb.co. And I'm hoping to do more like being in front of the camera this year, like because we get a lot of requests for like workshops and tutorials and so you can follow some of our like instructional information on Instagram at HNYCMB_CO, which is just Honeycomb Co without the vowels.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's me doing all of that Instagram stuff. If you're ever wondering who's writing the content.
Yeah,
awesome.
The things you make are always like brilliant. The little infographics.
Yeah, I love
Thank
your
you.
infographics and memes. Some of the best meme game in the business. So I'll put
that's high praise.
Yeah. So I'll put links to both of your websites in the description below this episode, either on the podcast website or on in the description below the video on YouTube. As for myself, I'm just going to keep doing the podcast. I'm almost finishing this series, and it's been a lot of fun. If people enjoy this work, or if you're learning a lot from it, consider signing up to my Patreon just in order to support the series, as well as future episodes I'm going to do, because I'm starting to think about what comes after this zodiac series, since we're going to be wrapping that up here in the next few months, and maybe doing an ongoing series on the houses and starting a series on each of the 12 houses after this.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see what
Sounds
happens.
good.
All right. Well, thanks both of you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. It's been awesome.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astro Gold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months, and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.